Hey guys, tonight we slip into a city that never truly goes quiet, 19th century New York, where the streets shine with damp under gaslight, and the air carries a layered perfume of coal smoke, horse sweat, brine off the river, and yesterday's bread turning stale in a doorway. You stand near the edge of Lower Manhattan, listening as iron-rimmed wheels rattle over uneven stones, and as a distant ferry horn drifts across dark water like a slow sigh. Your coat sits heavy on your shoulders, your medical bag heavier still, leather creaking when you shift your grip. Somewhere a window opens and closes. Somewhere a laugh flares up and fades. Even the night feels crowded here, like it has to share the sidewalk. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what your local time is. Just a small, gentle roll call of sleepy travelers. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin, as so many New Yorkers do, by walking, not with the confident stride of someone going to a ballroom or a sermon, but with the careful pace of someone who expects to be stopped by a question, by a shout, by a hand on your sleeve. The street is a narrow river of movement. Late workers heading home, men leaning in doorways, as if the wood frames have learned to hold them up. Women carrying parcels close to the body. A child darting between adults, with that fearless, feral grace children have in big cities. Your boots find the high spots between puddles, and the gas lamps above you burn with a soft halo, turning every face briefly theatrical as it passes through the light. This is not the polished New York of postcards that will be made later. This is the living, sweating, improvising city of the long 19th century, of swelling immigration, of tenements rising in tight stacks, of commerce that hums at all hours, and of neighborhoods that change character from block to block, like scenes shifting on a stage. You know, in the way you know a familiar ache, that the city has grown faster than its bones can handle. Streets widen, then choke. New buildings climb, then crowd. The harbor feeds it, the rail lines pull it, the factories keep it awake. And down here, in the lower wards, the night is not an ending so much as a different kind of shift. Your medical bag knocks lightly against your leg as you walk. It is not a magical object, not a guarantee. It is a small traveling cabinet of decisions, things that might help, things that sometimes harm, things people expect you to have because it comforts them to imagine that healing can be carried like a lantern. Inside are the familiar tools of a 19th century practitioner: bandages and lint, a few simple instruments, bottles carefully stoppered and wrapped, papers with notes that smudge if the air is too damp. You do not think of yourself as a hero. If anything, you feel more like a person trying to keep balance on a ship that keeps adding passengers. A call can come from anywhere. A shopkeeper who has been coughing for weeks and finally admits fear. A dock worker who has taken a bad fall and insists he's fine until he tries to stand. A mother with a child running hot with fever who has already tried home remedies and prayer and now wants the comfort of a trained voice. Some nights you are summoned politely, as if illness were a visitor that can be negotiated with. Other nights you are pulled into chaos, as if sickness has kicked in the door. And here is one of the city's quiet truths. You do not only treat bodies, you treat worry, you treat shame, you treat the stiff pride of people who have come too far to admit they are frightened. In the lower Manhattan streets of this era, doctor can mean many things: licensed physician, young apprentice, hospital man, dispensary volunteer, or someone whose authority rests mainly on a black bag and a steady manner. The city holds all kinds, and the boundaries can blur in the dim. You pass a newspaper boy dozing against a wall, the day's headlines still folded under his arm like a blanket. You pass a patrolman who watches you with the mild suspicion of a man trained to notice strangers. You nod, and he nods back, and you both pretend you are not doing what you are doing, measuring one another, deciding whether the night will be easy. In the distance, you can sense the neighborhoods that will soon loom larger in your workplaces, like 5 Points, famous even in its own time for overcrowding and poverty, and famous later in ways that sometimes flatten real lives into caricature. People will tell stories about it, as if it were only danger and vice. But you have learned to see the other truths living inside the same streets. The stubbornness of families, the endurance of those who keep washing shirts and mending shoes and carrying water upstairs, even when their lungs burn in winter. History loves a dramatic label. Life is usually a bundle of quieter, mixed realities. The night air shifts as you near a busier corner. A street vendor is packing up. A cart creaks. A horse stamps, impatient with the damp. You can hear the low chorus of a saloon, not loud enough to be a riot, just enough to be a warm cave of voices. For a moment you feel the city's humor, its refusal to be solemn for long. Even illness, here, is rarely permitted the luxury of complete silence. Someone will crack a joke between coughs. Someone will argue about payment while holding a compress to the forehead. Someone will insist they're not dying. Thank you very much. While lying very still. Then, like a thread tugged from the dark, you hear it. Your name, half spoken, half called by a voice that tries to sound calm and fails. You turn, and a young man steps toward you, hat in hand, eyes shining with that specific panic that makes people look both older and younger at once. "Doctor," he says, and the word lands with weight. He doesn't give you a surname or a title. He gives you a role, the way a drowning person calls for rope. You follow him down a narrower street, away from the brighter lamps. The buildings lean in, and the shadows grow thicker between doorways. This is where you feel, most sharply, that New York has layers. The well-lit avenues people boast about, and the dim corridors where the city's neglect pools like water. Here, a single tenement window can contain more life than a country house, and the stairwells smell of damp wood, old cooking, and the metallic tang of too many bodies sharing too little air. As you climb, step by careful step, your mind does what it always does. It sorts possibilities. Fever, infection, a fall, a childbirth gone wrong, a cough that sounds too deep. You have heard too many lungs to be easily reassured. You have also learned not to predict, because prediction is vanity, and the city loves to punish vanity. At the top landing, the young man pushes open a door, and you step into a room that is both home and clinic and waiting chamber all at once. The light is thin, one lamp, maybe two, and it catches the edges of faces gathered close. There is a woman seated by the bed, shoulders tight, hands busy with nothing because there is nothing to do with them. There is a child watching you with wide eyes, quiet, as if quietness itself might help. There is an older neighbor who has come, not because she knows medicine, but because no one should be frightened alone. On the bed lies the patient, breathing shallowly. The sounds are soft, the scrape of fabric, the whisper of a prayer, the faint clink of your bag as you set it down, but you feel the room's urgency, the way you feel a change in weather. You wash your hands as well as you can in the water offered, aware, in a half-formed way, that cleanliness matters even if the reasons are still being argued in lecture halls. In these decades, some doctors still talk of bad air and miasma as the chief villain, while others begin to speak more insistently about invisible agents, about contagion and germs, ideas that will gain power as the century moves on, but do not yet feel settled to everyone. Even among the learned, certainty comes slowly. Historians still argue over how quickly germ theory changed everyday practice, and how much older habits lingered in the face of new evidence. You kneel beside the bed. You speak gently, and you ask simple questions, because simple questions are lanterns in a dark room. How long? Any pain? Any vomiting? Any chills? Any cough? Your voice is calm, not because you are always calm, but because you have learned that calm can be shared like warmth. The woman answers with quick, clipped words, then pauses, then says, almost apologetically, that they did not want to bother you. You have heard this sentence in 100 forms. It is the sound of people calculating whether they deserve help. Outside, a cart rolls by and fades. Somewhere, a distant church bell marks an hour without looking inside these rooms to see who is awake and afraid. New York keeps time with bells and whistles and footsteps, but sickness keeps its own time, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always personal. You open your bag, the little glass bottles catch the lamplight. The family watches your hands the way people watch a magician. not because they truly believe in magic, but because they cannot bear the alternative, which is helplessness. You feel, in that moment, the strange position you occupy in this city, 1 foot in science that is still forming, 1 foot in tradition that refuses to vanish, both feet on a stairway that creaks under the weight of too many needs. And you begin, quietly, to do what you came to do. To listen, to observe, to offer what care you can, while the gaslit streets outside continue their restless, indifferent lullaby. You leave that first room the way you leave a small chapel slowly, without turning your back too quickly, as if the air itself might change if you move wrong. A few words have been said in low voices, and you have done what you can do tonight. Eased a fever with what remedies are available, advised rest that may or may not be possible in a crowded home, and left instructions that sound simple in a calm voice, but become complicated the moment you step out into the hall. You feel the familiar mix of relief and unfinishedness, like closing a book mid-page. The stairwell swallows you again. Wood groans under your boots. Somewhere below, a baby cries and then stops, as if remembering it is late. The young man who fetched you follows a step behind, still clutching his hat. At the landing, he offers payment with the stiff politeness of someone trying to keep dignity intact. Sometimes it is coins warmed by a long time in a pocket. Sometimes it is a promise. Sometimes it is nothing but gratitude and a look that says, "Please don't think less of us." In New York, in this era, a doctor's work often floats between charity and commerce, between calling and calculation. You take what is fair, no more, no less, and you let your voice soften again when you say you will return if needed. The promise is both kindness and burden. You cannot be everywhere, yet the city keeps asking you to be. Outside, the night meets you with damp cheeks of air, a little colder now. Gas lamps flicker. Their light trembles on puddles like candlelight on a shaken tray. You begin walking toward a district that everyone seems to know by reputation, even those who have never set foot in it. The 5 Points. In the middle decades of the 19th century, this neighborhood becomes a symbol in newspapers and reform pamphlets, a shorthand for overcrowding, poverty, and crime. But symbols are blunt instruments. You go there not to confirm a legend, but to meet people who wake up every day inside it. As you approach, the city's sounds change, the streets tighten, and the density becomes something you can feel in your ribs. Doorways multiply. Windows glow with lamplight behind thin curtains. You catch the smell of cabbage boiling long past its ideal moment, the sour edge of damp plaster, the sweet burn of cheap tobacco, the yeast of beer. In one open window, you hear a fiddle, quick and lively, as if music is being used like a broom to sweep worries into a corner. You are careful with your footing. The paving stones are uneven, and in low places, water gathers water that, in many parts of the city, is not reliably clean. You remember, as everyone does, the fear of cholera years, especially the epidemic of 1832 that hit New York hard, and later outbreaks that returned like unwanted weather. Even if you are not living in 1832 tonight, its memory hangs over the city. People speak of it the way they speak of a great fire or a riot, as proof that the city can turn suddenly fragile. And in neighborhoods where privies overflow and drains run poorly, where crowds pack tight, disease is not an abstract lecture topic. It is a neighbor with a heavy hand. You pass a building whose front looks ordinary enough brick, a stoop, a door with paint worn thin, until you notice the stream of bodies. In and out, up and down. A tenement is a word that can sound almost neat, like a category in a ledger. In practice, it can mean families stacked in small rooms, air shared as if it were a ration, privacy reduced to a curtain if you're lucky. In these decades, the city's housing pressures push people into spaces not designed for so many lives, and later in the century, reformers will describe rooms with few windows and poor ventilation. The Tenement House Act of 1867 and later laws will try imperfectly to force improvements. But tonight, the law feels far away. Tonight, you climb whatever stairs you are given. A woman meets you in the doorway, hair loosely tied, sleeves rolled. Her eyes are tired in the way of someone who does not get enough sleep even when she closes them. She speaks quickly. There is a child with a cough that won't stop, and a father who won't rest, and a neighbor who fainted in the hallway and scared everyone half to death. You listen, and you follow, and you let your face stay neutral, because fear can spread through a tenement faster than any illness. The room you enter is narrow, but not empty. A table, a few chairs, bedding rolled and unrolled according to the hour. A small stove that tries bravely to heat more air than it can manage. Clothing hung to dry where it can. You can tell, even without asking, that money is tight. In this neighborhood, money is often a visitor, not a resident. The child sits propped against a pillow, eyes glassy, cheeks flushed. The cough comes in little storms, sharp, then rattling, then leaving the throat raw. You sit, you lean close, and you listen with the tools available to you. In the 19th century, the stethoscope exists, introduced earlier in the century in France, yet its everyday adoption varies, and not every street doctor carries one or uses it constantly. Whether you press ear close or use an instrument, the act is the same. You become a listener, not only to the lungs, but to the story the body tells. Breathing is never just breathing here. Smoke from coal fires hangs in the city air. Workshops and factories add their own dust. In winter, people keep windows shut because cold is not romantic when you're already hungry. Consumption, what later generations will call tuberculosis, haunts families, and it is one of those illnesses that seems to write itself into the city's mythology. You are careful with what you say. A label can soothe if it gives shape, but it can also terrify if it sounds like a sentence. You ask gentle questions. How long? Any fever? Any rash? Has the child been eating? You glance at the mother's hands, chapped, reddened hands that have been scrubbed in cold water. You notice the small objects that tell you more than words. A half-empty jar of something meant to be a remedy, perhaps purchased from a shop with promises painted on the window. A cloth folded neatly, ready to be used again. A cup that has been boiled and reused so many times, it looks permanently tired. This is the lesser-known, quietly documented reality of urban medicine. How much of your work depends on domestic improvisation? Families here know their own forms of care. They know teas, poultices, steam from a pot, careful bundling in blankets, prayers spoken in many languages. The city's immigrant neighborhoods carry medical traditions from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and beyond, sometimes blending with American practices, sometimes clashing with what a formally trained physician insists upon. Historians still debate how these folk practices interacted with professional medicine, whether doctors largely dismissed them, or whether, on the ground, survival forced a kind of practical coexistence. You do not scold. You do not turn your voice into a courtroom. You know that people do what they can. When the mother shows you a bottle and asks if it is good, you weigh your answer like a coin. Patent medicines, those widely advertised cures, are everywhere in 19th century America, and their claims can be extravagant. Some contain ingredients that genuinely ease symptoms. Others can be useless or worse. You do not lecture her about regulation that barely exists yet. You simply guide her toward what is safer, what is gentler, what is less likely to steal money and give nothing back. The child coughs again, and you place a cool hand to the forehead. You recommend warmth, fluids if they can manage, rest if the room allows it. You might suggest a simple expectorant or a soothing mixture, something that aligns with the period's common practice without promising miracles. You speak carefully about warning signs. If breathing worsens, if the fever climbs and does not break, if the child becomes too weak, send for help again. Your calm is a rope you throw across the panic. Then, as you stand, your gaze drifts to the corner of the room, where a man sits hunched, shoulders tight, jaw set. The father, he has the look of someone who refuses vulnerability because he believes it is a luxury he cannot afford. He has a cough too quieter, controlled, as if he thinks he can negotiate with it by pretending it doesn't matter. You ask him, gently, if he is unwell. He shrugs, and in that shrug is a whole city's worth of denial. It's nothing, he says. And you hear how often he has said it. You want to tell him that nothing can become something fast in a place like this. But you also know that telling a laboring man to rest can sound like telling him to stop being himself. So you choose a softer approach. You ask about his work. You ask about the hours. You ask about the air he breathes. You ask as if you are curious, not accusing. Slowly, he answers. And as he answers, you learn, again, that your true clinic is not only a room, but the entire structure of the city, its labor, its housing, its water, its politics. When you step back into the hallway, the neighbor who fainted is sitting upright now, embarrassed, insisting she is fine, insisting everyone is making a fuss. You check her pulse. You ask if she has eaten. You look at her face in the dim light. In overcrowded quarters, fainting can be simple exhaustion, hunger, heat, anxiety. It can also be the first whisper of something deeper. You do what you can in the moment. Offer reassurance, suggest food, caution her to rise slowly, and watch for signs that return. Down the stairs and back onto the street, you feel the 5 points around you, like a living organism, rooms stacked like cells, alleys like veins, voices like a heartbeat. The city is not cruel on purpose, you think. It is simply vast, and often indifferent, and built faster than its conscience can keep up. You walk on, your bag bumping at your side, and you let the night sounds wash over you. Somewhere, laughter spills from a crowded room. Somewhere, someone argues softly in a language you do not speak. Somewhere, a child begins to cry again and is soothed. The gas lamps burn on, steady enough to feel like kindness. And you keep going, because in this city, another door is always waiting to open. By the time you drift out of the 5 Point streets, the night has thinned at the edges. Not quite morning, not quite the deep hours anymore, just that grey in between when the city looks tired enough to admit it has bones. The gas lamps still burn, but their glow feels weaker now, as if they, too, are ready to go home. You walk with your shoulders slightly hunched, not from drama, but from the practical habit of bracing against damp wind and unexpected elbows. Your bag has the steady, familiar weight of responsibility, and your mind keeps replaying rooms. The child's cough, the father's stubborn silence, the neighbor's embarrassed insistence that she's fine. New York, you've learned, is full of people who treat suffering like a private matter until it becomes impossible to hide. Somewhere ahead, a different kind of medicine waits for you, not the staircase visits and whispered prayers, but the public face of care, the dispensary. In this city, dispensaries have a long history. One of the better known is the New York Dispensary, founded back in the 1792, intended to provide medical help and medicines to the poor. Over the decades, the idea spreads. Charity clinics, mission-based care, outpatient services attached to hospitals. In practice, it means a door that opens on certain hours, a room with benches, and a queue that begins forming before the staff has even lit the day's lamps. When you arrive, you're not greeted by silence, you're greeted by waiting. The line bends along the building like a slow, patient snake. People stand shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in worn coats, clutching children, holding parcels that are not groceries but documents, small notes, letters, tokens of legitimacy. A few are alone, staring at the ground as if eye contact might cost them their place. A few speak softly, in Irish accents, German consonants, Italian rhythms, and the many blended tones of a city that is constantly becoming itself. You stand near the entrance and watch the human geometry of it, the way the sick lean slightly inward, protecting their chests, the way the anxious hover near the door, measuring each minute, the way the truly exhausted sit down right where they are, because the sidewalk is as good a bench as any. A boy no older than 10 holds a smaller child's hand, both of them unnaturally quiet. An older woman keeps her chin high, as if she's determined not to look like someone who needs charity even while she's standing in a line for it. This is the price of mercy in 19th-century New York. Not always money, though money matters, but time and dignity. Inside, the air smells of damp wool, an old disinfectant, attempts vinegar, soap, Whatever people believe will cleanse what they cannot see. There are benches, a desk, shelves, papers. The room is functional in the way a lifeboat is functional. It is not built for comfort. It is built because the alternative is worse. You take your place among the staff, sometimes as a practitioner, sometimes as an assistant, depending on where in your career you are and on how this particular institution is organized. The line outside turns into a steady stream. The door opens, bodies flow in, questions begin. The first faces are often the ones with obvious need. A child with a fever who has gone limp with fatigue, a laborer who holds his wrist strangely, the hand swelling in a way that suggests he tried to work through something he shouldn't have, a woman whose eyes dart around the room, wary of being judged, a man with a cough that sounds like it has lived in him for months, maybe years. You learn, quickly, that a dispensary is not a place where you do slow, luxurious diagnosis. It is triage before the word becomes common in every mouth. It is sorting, choosing, prioritizing, sometimes with nothing but a glance, a few questions, and what your hands can tell you in a minute or two. You ask names, you ask ages, you ask how long, you ask what they can afford, and there it is again, that invisible thing you treat alongside the body. Shame. Some dispensaries and charities, in this era, try to draw boundaries between the deserving and undeserving poor ideas that float through reform circles, sermons, and newspaper editorials. The language changes from decade to decade, but the moral temperature stays similar. Help is offered, and then it is measured, as if compassion must be rationed to prevent it from encouraging dependence. Historians still argue about the effect of this, how much it shaped policy and practice, and how patients learn to perform respectability to receive care. You see that performance in small gestures. A man removes his hat before he reaches your desk, even though his hands are trembling. A woman straightens her collar and speaks with a careful politeness that sounds rehearsed. People bring letters from a minister or an employer when they can, as if a recommendation might prove their suffering is legitimate. Others have nothing but the visible evidence of hardship and a willingness to wait. And you, standing there, have to choose what kind of doctor you will be. Not simply skilled or unskilled, though skill matters, but soft or sharp, curious or dismissive, willing to hear a full story, or eager to move to the next patient, because the line is too long and your own fatigue has started to harden. You try, as best you can, to keep your voice gentle. A calm voice is a kind of medicine here, cheap and effective, and you can administer it endlessly without running out. You learn to say, "Tell me what's been happening," in a way that doesn't sound like an interrogation. You learn to look at a person's face instead of only their symptoms. Still, the pace presses on you. The door opens again and again. The benches fill. A child begins to cry, and then quiets, cheek pressed to a mother's shoulder. A clerk scribbles notes, ink scratching on paper, like a small, frantic insect. Bottles are passed out with instructions that must compete with fear, illiteracy, and the simple chaos of crowded life. And always, always, there is the question of what you can actually offer. 19th century medicine is a world of transitions. Some things are new and genuinely helpful. Some are traditional and occasionally soothing. Some are simply all you have. You can recommend rest even when people cannot rest. You can advise fresh air even when the streets outside are choked with smoke and the apartment window opens onto another wall. You can prescribe simple treatments and hope they do more good than harm. There are moments that feel almost unbearably tender. A mother holds out her child's arm, and you see the small marks of poverty's everyday battle. A rash, a bruise, a scrape that hasn't healed well, because cleanliness is difficult when water is carried upstairs and everyone shares the same basin. You do not accuse. You simply treat what you can, and you speak as if this family is worth the same patience as any other. The mother's shoulders drop a fraction, as if she has been holding herself up by force, and your tone has finally allowed her to lean. There are moments that feel sharper. A man arrives smelling of alcohol, and the clerk stiffens, and you can feel the room's judgment. You remember, gently, that addiction and drinking are not moral fables, but human stories, often tangled with pain, labor, and despair. You do not romanticize it. You do not scold him like a child. You treat what is in front of you: nausea, injury, withdrawal tremors, if you notice them, while keeping the atmosphere steady, safe. You think of how easy it is for institutions to become harsh, and how hard it is to keep mercy from turning into punishment. The dispensary is also a stage where the city's inequalities become visible in the smallest details. Some patients speak English easily, others struggle, and you find yourself using gestures, tone, and whatever shared words you can gather. Sometimes a child translates for a parent, which feels both resourceful and quietly heartbreaking, because children should not have to interpret their own family's fear. As the hours pass, you become aware of another kind of fatigue. The fatigue of being needed by strangers in an endless stream. Even your hands begin to feel less like your hands and more like tools. You catch yourself starting to rush, and you pull yourself back, the way you might catch yourself speaking too loudly in a church. This is the interpretive question that hums beneath everything. Does charity medicine in a place like New York relieve suffering? Or does it sometimes hide deeper wounds by offering small bandages where larger change is needed? Some scholars see dispensaries as crucial early public health infrastructure, a bridge between private doctors and a modern medical system. Others emphasize how charity could be moralizing, uneven, and inadequate, especially when the root causes were housing, wages, sanitation, and crowding. Standing here, watching the line, you feel both truths at once. Near midday, the light shifts in the room. The air warms slightly. The line outside is still long. You step back for a moment, to drink a little water, to breathe. In that pause, you look around at the benches, at the faces, at the hands clutching bottles and papers. You realize how many lives intersect in this plain room, how many stories pass through your hands and then back out into the streets. You return to the desk. The next patient sits. You ask your questions again, softly, steadily, as if each person deserves their own calm pocket of time, even in the middle of an endless city. And when you glance toward the door, you see it another wave of waiting bodies. New York's unspoken reminder that, outside these walls, the need is always larger than the help. The dispensary door closes behind you with a soft, tired click, and for a moment, you stand in the street as if you've stepped out of a warm, crowded dream into colder reality. The city greets you again with its familiar chorus, hoofbeats, wheels, distant calls, and with something harder to describe. That faint, sour edge in the air that makes you swallow and then pretend you didn't. You begin walking, because walking is how you think in New York. The sidewalks keep your mind moving, and the blocks stitch together your day's faces into a single, long ribbon of need. The light has shifted since the early hours. Even in daytime, the streets can feel dim between tall buildings, and in the lower wards, the sun is often filtered through smoke, laundry lines, and the sheer density of life. As you pass a gutter where water gathers in a shallow, slow puddle, you find yourself remembering old stories, stories every New Yorker seems to carry like a scar. Cholera. The word is never far from the city's tongue in the 19th century. Even when the disease isn't currently raging, it lingers as memory and warning, the way people still flinch years after a terrible storm. You can't think about cholera without thinking about 1832, the year the fear arrived like a cold wind off the harbor. People in New York watched reports from abroad, watched rumors move faster than ships, and then watched their own neighbors fall ill with frightening speed. The city learned, in that season, how fast confidence can evaporate. Some people fled north or to the countryside if they could. Others couldn't leave because they were poor, because their jobs were here, because their families were here, because the city had its hooks in them. And the ones who stayed learned that panic is its own kind of contagion, passing from face to face as quickly as any illness. You walk past a vendor rinsing something in a bucket, and your mind tugs gently at the knot of confusion that cholera always brings. Even among doctors, the explanations are not fully settled in these decades. Many people still hold to the idea of miasma, bad air, foul vapors rising from filth, from stagnant water, from decaying matter. It is an intuitive theory. In a way, the city does smell. The stench feels like proof. And when disease follows poverty and crowding, it's easy to blame the air that hangs over those places. Yet there is another current of thought flowing through medicine, quieter at first, and then steadily stronger as the century moves on, that something invisible and specific is doing the damage, something that travels from person to person, often through what they drink. You may not have the language for microbes on every tongue yet, but you can feel the ground shifting under the old certainty. The city's own infrastructure becomes part of this argument, as if pipes and drains are suddenly medical texts written in iron. You think of water, how it is carried, how it is stored, how it is trusted. For much of the early century, many New Yorkers rely on wells, pumps, cisterns, and water sold by vendors. In crowded districts, those sources can be dangerously close to privies and waste pits. People talk about bad neighborhoods and bad morals, but sometimes the simplest truth is that water and waste are too close together. When the Croton Aqueduct opens in 1842, bringing water from upstate into the city, it becomes one of those great civic achievements people boast about with a kind of relieved pride. Clean water feels like a promise that the modern city can protect itself, and yet even that promise is uneven. Pipes and access don't reach everyone in the same way at the same pace, and the poorest neighborhoods can remain vulnerable. A marvel of engineering does not instantly cure overcrowding, nor does it teach every landlord to care about sanitation. You keep walking, and the city keeps offering you little reminders, like a lesson repeating until it is learned. A cart passes with barrels that slosh faintly, and you notice the driver's wary expression, as if he expects complaint. Not all waste moves through sewers yet. In many places, it is collected, carried, dumped, managed in ways that are messy and imperfect. Night soil work emptying privy vaults exists in the shadows of the city's pride. It's not the kind of labor that ends up in heroic paintings, but it is part of what keeps the streets from turning into something unlivable. You imagine the men who do it, the smell that clings to them, the way society looks away even as it depends on them. And still the fear remains, because in the middle of the century cholera returns again. 1849, 1866. The dates don't feel like numbers so much as seasons the city would rather forget, and yet cannot. Each outbreak revives the arguments. Is it in the air? Is it in the water? Is it punishment? Is it chance? Is it foreign ships, foreign bodies, foreign poverty? The ugliest reflex of a frightened city is to search for someone to blame. You feel that reflex around you like static. You turn onto a street where the smell is sharper: refuse, damp wood, the sourness of a drain. A group of residents stands near a corner, talking quickly. Their faces are tight, and their voices have the wary edge of rumor. Down the way, someone says, a family 3 days, and the sentence breaks. Not with drama, but with that human unwillingness to finish a frightening thought out loud. You move toward the address, and you feel how quickly your body becomes all business. Hands steady, voice ready, bag gripped. Inside the building, the hallway is close and warm, crowded with breath. Doors are shut, but you can feel people listening behind them. In places like this, illness is never private. Even if you try to keep it contained, it leaks into the shared air of stairwells and whispers. A woman opens the door to the apartment you seek. Her eyes lock onto yours with a desperation that is almost formal, as if she has been rehearsing how to ask for help without falling apart. She steps aside and lets you in. The room is dim, curtains drawn not for elegance but for protection from heat, from glare, from neighbors' eyes. A basin sits on a table. A cloth is folded nearby. You see the small signs of someone trying to keep order. A cup set neatly, a blanket smoothed, a corner swept. When life turns frightening, people often reach for tidiness the way they reach for prayer. You approach the bed, and you recognize the posture of a body that has been drained of ease. You do not describe it in harsh detail, not in this bedtime hour, but you can't ignore the seriousness in the room. The family looks at you as if you are an answer. You know better. You are a person with limited tools, standing in the middle of a century still learning what it is fighting. You ask about the water they drink, Where do they draw it from? Is it from a pump? A tap? Do they boil it? The questions feel strangely domestic for a medical visit, like asking about laundry or soup, and yet you have learned that epidemics hide in such ordinary places. The woman answers, confused at first, then sharper, as if she suddenly understands why you're asking. She gestures toward a container. You note its cleanliness, or lack of it, not with judgment, but with grim attention. Here is the delicate tension you carry. You must speak with authority, because frightened people need something solid to lean on. But you must not speak beyond what is true. You cannot promise certainty where the century itself has not settled the matter. You recommend what precautions you can: clean water if possible, boiling when possible, keeping waste away from drinking sources, washing hands and cloths as best they can. You say it gently, because in a crowded tenement, keep things separate can sound like a cruel joke. Separation is a luxury. Space is a luxury. Even time can be a luxury. And in the background of your mind, you hear the larger machinery of the city turning, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, toward public health. In 1866, New York establishes the Metropolitan Board of Health, an early, powerful attempt to give the city real authority over sanitation and disease control. It's one of those institutional landmarks that marks a shift. The idea that health is not only a private matter between doctor and patient, but something a city must manage through streets, water, waste, and housing. People argue about it, of course, about power, about intrusion, about expense. Some applaud, some resist. But the very existence of such a board is a sign of changing times, a sign that the city is beginning to admit what you already feel in your bones. Illness doesn't respect property lines. You stand at the bedside and let your voice stay low and steady. You tell the family what to watch for, when to seek more help, how to keep the sick as comfortable as possible. You do not offer melodrama. You do not turn suffering into spectacle. You simply stay present, because presence is sometimes the only gift that fits in your bag. As you leave, you notice neighbors in the hallway pretending not to watch, while watching anyway. Fear makes people curious and cautious at the same time. You move carefully, speaking softly, not feeding panic. You know how a story of cholera can spread, from one staircase to an entire block, from an entire block to a citywide shiver. Outside again, the daylight feels oddly thin. The air smells the same, yet now every smell seems suspicious. That is the trick of epidemics. They teach you to distrust the ordinary. You walk on, and the city's debate walks with you: bad air versus bad water, miasma versus invisible agents, old theories that match the nose versus new theories that demand faith in what cannot be seen. Historians still argue about how quickly the germ idea became everyday practice, and how often older explanations continued alongside it. Standing here, you can believe that history isn't a clean swap from wrong to right. It's more like the city itself. Layers, built on layers. Old bricks under new paint. Habits lingering long after laws change. A breeze shifts, and for a moment the air smells fresher. River wind cutting through smoke. You inhale, not deeply, just enough to feel the relief of it. Then you let the breath go. You keep walking, because New York does not pause for theory. It only pauses for the next knock, the next rumor, the next patient waiting at the edge of your day. The city keeps its busiest noises for the streets you can pay to belong to, but the river holds a different kind of sound: water, slapping softly at pilings, rigging creaking, the low, patient groan of a ferry easing away from shore. You find yourself here more often than you'd like, standing with your coat buttoned high, your medical bag tucked close, watching Manhattan's jagged line of buildings recede as if the city is politely pretending it can place its troubles somewhere else. Out on the East River, the air tastes cleaner for a moment. It's colder, too, and it brings your thoughts into sharper focus. You're headed toward the city's edges, those islands that New York uses like storage rooms for the people and problems it doesn't know how to hold in plain sight. Blackwell's Island lies ahead, long and narrow in the water, and in the 19th century, it becomes a kind of municipal constellation, a penitentiary, hospitals, and institutions gathered together where the city can say, "Look, we are doing something," without having to see those lives on every street corner. You can't help noticing the irony. The very same river that brings commerce and immigrants and oysters and news also carries the sick and the poor and the incurable away from the bright avenues. The ferry is crowded, not with tourists, those will come later, but with workers and attendants, with visitors holding small bundles, with people who don't quite meet one another's eyes. A woman sits with her hands folded tight over a basket, staring at the water as if it might give her an answer. A man keeps glancing toward the island, jaw clenched, as if he's trying to swallow down anger before it escapes in public. The air smells of wool and river salt and coal smoke drifting from steamers. You are not here because you enjoy the ride. You are here because a city doctor learns, sooner or later, that illness is not only a matter of rooms and remedies, it is a matter of where a society puts people when they become inconvenient. When you step onto the island, the mood changes immediately. The streets are quieter, the buildings feel more official, broad walls, institutional angles, the kind of architecture meant to endure and contain. There's a discipline in the air, as if even the wind has rules. You walk toward the hospital buildings first, because that is the part of this world that fits into your bag and your training. On Blackwell's Island, City Hospital has roots earlier in the century, originally serving prisoners, and later expanding into a broader charity role. The very idea of charity hospital carries a double edge. It can be a refuge, and it can be a label stamped on a person's life like a verdict. Some patients arrive grateful, others arrive furious. Many arrive too tired to feel anything but resignation. Inside, the corridors are long and the light is functional. The smell is a mix of soap, damp stone, and the faint sourness that clings to crowded wards, no matter how often someone scrubs. Windows frame the river like a painting that never changes, even as the patients do. You can hear footsteps, murmured instructions, the occasional cough echoing softly sound traveling farther in a place designed for order. This is where you meet the city's quiet exiles, the chronically ill, the poor who cannot recover fast enough to return to work, people with disabilities who have no family able or willing to care for them, the elderly who have outlived their resources. In the language of the time, you'll hear words like incurables, a term that doesn't always mean hopeless in the modern sense, but rather not easily treated, not quickly fixed, not suited to be sent back into the city's spinning machinery. You move through a ward with your calm voice ready, and you feel the familiar tension in your chest, the urge to help, and the awareness of how much this place is also about sorting. Who gets a bed? Who gets moved along? Who gets classified into the next building down the road? Not far from the hospital world is the world of confinement. The island holds the penitentiary, and around it the sense that punishment and care are neighbours here, separated by paperwork more than spirit. You can feel it in the way attendants speak, in the way keys hang heavy on belts, in the way certain doors close with a final, practiced sound. And then there is the asylum. By 1839, the New York City Lunatic Asylum begins accepting patients on Blackwell's Island, one of those historical anchors that sits like a milestone in the city's developing system of institutions. You do not walk into it with the thrill of curiosity. You walk in with the slow caution of someone stepping into a place where words can do harm. The asylum corridors feel different from the hospital corridors, even when they share the same grey light. There is less of the bustle of treatment, more of the hush of supervision. You see people sitting quietly, eyes fixed on something you cannot see. You see others pacing in short loops, as if the floor itself is a track their mind has been set to follow. You see attendants trying to keep order with routines, meals, walks, laundry, prayer, silence. The 19th century is full of arguments about what causes mental distress and what helps it: moral failings, physical ailments, heredity, trauma, nervous strain from modern life. And different superintendents and reformers insist on different treatments, from kindness and structure to restraint and isolation. You keep your face gentle. You keep your voice low. You do not turn anyone into a story. Historians still debate whether these asylums were, at their best, sincere attempts at humane care, an alternative to leaving people to suffer in jails or streets, or whether they also served as tools of social control, places where the city could place those who disrupted its preferred picture of order. Standing here, you can feel both truths pressing together, like two hands on the same shoulder. You step out again and breathe the river air, and it feels like your lungs have been holding something back. Later in the century, the islands multiply their functions. On Blackwell's Island, a dedicated smallpox hospital opens in 1856, designed in a dramatic Gothic style that seems almost too beautiful for its purpose. It is an architectural reminder of a public health strategy that feels both rational and chilling. Isolate the contagious. Put them across the water. Keep the city safe by moving risk elsewhere. The logic is straightforward. The human experience, less so. And then, as New York's population surges and its institutions overflow, you find yourself hearing more and more about Ward's Island too, another place in the East River constellation, increasingly tied to the city's systems for managing mental illness and long-term care. In the 1,870 seconds, a major institution opens there for the insane, part of a growing network of asylums. As the century pushes onward, the geography begins to feel like a map of the city's anxieties. Illness here, poverty there, confinement over there, all ringed by water. You have come today for a specific case, someone transferred, someone placed, someone whose name is now attached to a bed number. The paperwork is tidy, the human being is not. You sit with a patient whose story is hard to separate from the city itself. Maybe it's a man, worn down by years of unstable work and chronic pain. Maybe it's a woman whose grief has become too loud for her household to tolerate. Maybe it's someone whose disability makes independent survival impossible in a tenement built like a stairwell trap. You do not decide, in a single visit, what is wrong with them. You simply witness how quickly the boundary between medical need and social problem dissolves here. You notice the smaller details that stick with you, the lesser-known, unglamorous reality of institutional life. The way clothing is marked and inventoried. The way personal objects are limited. The way schedules become a substitute for freedom. You notice the smell of boiled linens and watered-down stew. You notice how the river is always visible, always there, like a reminder that the city is close enough to see, but not close enough to reach. When you finally step back onto the ferry, Manhattan's skyline looks different. From here, it is beautiful in a distant way, sunlight on rooftops, masts and chimneys drawn like pencil lines. It is easy to forget, from the shore, that the city's solutions often involve distance. The boat rocks gently, and you let the motion soften your shoulders. You think about the people you've seen today, patients in beds, patients in routines, patients in rooms where the window opens only a crack. You think about the families on the mainland who will say, "Hess on the island now," or "Shes being cared for," words that carry both relief and grief. And as the ferry noses back toward the city's noise, you feel the next wave already forming, another day of house calls, another winter cough, another crowded staircase. New York accepts your return without ceremony, as if the river crossing was only a brief breath between demands. Back on Manhattan's side of the river, you step off the ferry and feel the city's breath change. The water air that had cleared your head is replaced by something denser, coal smoke, damp wool, the faint animal warmth of horses, and the winter's sharp habit of finding the unbuttoned gap at your throat. The cold is not clean here. It's a working cold, already mixed with soot before it reaches your lungs. You pull your coat tighter and join the flow of people moving along the street. New York in winter is a city that hurries, not out of cheer, but out of survival. Faces angle down, hands vanish into pockets, shoulders rise as if everyone is trying to make their bodies smaller targets for the wind. A bell rings ahead, bright, metallic, and you see the horse car rolling along its iron rails, the horses' hooves clicking and slipping in a rhythm that feels almost soothing if you don't look too closely at how hard they work. Horse-drawn streetcars have become part of the city's daily machinery by the middle of the century, carving predictable lines through neighborhoods that otherwise feel like chaos. You step up, pay your fare to the conductor with chilled fingers, and take a place among bundled bodies. The interior smells of wet coats and breath and leather, and the windows fog softly at the edges, turning the outside world into a blurred watercolor of movement. As the car lurches forward, you let the motion carry you, your medical bag tucked close, your mind already reaching for its next address. House calls, in this season, feel like you're forever walking into rooms where the air itself is tired. You get off near a row of buildings that seem to lean together for warmth. The street is slick, where yesterday's snow has been trampled into grey slush. Children, somehow still children, skim across it with the reckless grace of those who assume winter is a game. Adults move like careful old ships, testing each step. A door opens, and you climb. The stairwell is colder than the room you're heading toward, and you can taste the damp on the wood. At the top landing, the apartment door is already cracked, waiting, as if the family has been listening for your footsteps for an hour. Inside, heat hits you in a wave, thick, uneven, too close to the stove, and nowhere near enough in the corners. A coal fire glows like a small, angry eye. The air has that familiar sting. Smoke that doesn't quite go up the chimney, mingling with boiled water, old linens, and the sourness of a cough that's been living in the room for days. The patient sits propped up, shoulders rounded forward, working for each breath. In winter, you see lungs more than you see anything else. Lungs and throats, and the fragile bridge between warm interior flesh and the brutal outside air. People call it many things: a cold, a chest sickness, a winter fever, inflammation, bronchitis. And when it's prolonged, when it lingers and thins the body and steals the color from cheeks, they call it by the name that carries a hush behind it: consumption. You do not say that word casually. You've learned how it changes a room. You sit close enough to be heard without forcing your voice into a harsh projection. You ask the steady questions that make a map out of fear. How long? Any fever? Any pain when breathing? Is the cough dry or wet? Any blood? And you measure your tone carefully when you ask that last one, because you don't want the family's thoughts to sprint ahead into panic. You listen to the chest by ear, by whatever instrument you trust, by the simple, practiced attention of someone trained to notice patterns in sound. The breathing is rough in places, too quiet in others. You smell the room and think, not for the first time, that the city's poorest homes wage a daily war between warmth and air. Open a window and you invite the cold that can stiffen joints and chill a sick body into shivering exhaustion. Keep it shut and you trap smoke, moisture, and everyone's breath in one shared atmosphere. It's a cruel choice. Freeze or choke, and try to call it living. You recommend what you can. Warmth, yes, but not the kind that fills the room with smoke. Fluids, if they can manage. Rest, which always sounds simple until you remember the rent, the hunger, the job that won't wait for anyone's lungs to recover. You might suggest a poultice or a mustard plaster, things many families already know. Common in the period's domestic medicine, more for comfort than cure, a way of giving the household something gentle to do besides sit and watch. You speak carefully about stronger medicines, because this century loves remedies that dull pain and quiet coughs, and not all of them are kind in the long run. You keep your guidance cautious, your promises modest, because you've seen what happens when hope is sold like a miracle. The mother watches your hands the way people watch weather, trying to read tomorrow in today's signs. A father stands in the corner, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor, as if looking directly at illness might challenge his ability to endure it. A child peeks from behind a chair, eyes wide, learning too early how fragile adults can be. When you rise to leave, you feel the heat cling to you like a shawl, and the hallway's cold grabs it back instantly. You descend the stairs and step into the street, where the wind scours your face clean of indoor air. Another call waits only a few blocks away. Winter does not do you the courtesy of spacing its suffering. This time, the home is slightly better off. More space, fewer bodies in each room, but the sickness is familiar. An older man lies in bed with a fevered flush, breathing shallowly, each inhale a careful negotiation. In the 19th century, pneumonia has a reputation that arrives before you do. People speak of it with a fatalistic respect, as if it's a stern visitor that doesn't accept excuses. You sit by the bedside and feel how the family's anxiety is different here. Not frantic, but heavy, like a wet blanket. They've seen neighbors not come back from this. You do what you can. Listen, advise. Try to keep the patient comfortable. Remind the family to watch for worsening breath and confusion. You keep your voice low and steady, because steadiness is something you can offer, even when certainty is not. Outside, the afternoon light fades early. Winter pulling the day's curtain closed before anyone is ready. The horse cars continue to rumble by, the horse's breath visible in pale bursts. The city keeps moving because it must. You watch a worker step off the car with a stiff gait, one hand pressed to his side as if he's holding something in place. The streets are full of people walking around with illnesses, half hidden under pride and necessity, saving their collapse for the privacy of a room they may share with 5 others. You make another house call in a basement apartment, where damp climbs the walls in dark stains. Here the cough is everywhere, one person, then another, like a song passed around the room. You notice spittoons tucked near chairs, a practical attempt at cleanliness. And you think of how the city is slowly learning to fear what comes from the lungs. Not everyone agrees yet on why it spreads, or what the true enemy is: bad air, weakness, heredity, chance, poverty itself. The arguments are still alive in lectures and papers and doctors' conversations. Some will later point to a turning point in the 1880 seconds, when laboratory science makes bold claims about specific causes for diseases like tuberculosis. But standing in this damp room, you can feel how far theory still is from the daily reality of families who simply need to keep breathing. This is the interpretive truth that keeps returning to you like a refrain. Winter illness in New York is not only biology, it is architecture, it is wages, it is fuel. It is the landlord who doesn't repair a window so a draft whistles across a child's bed all night. It is the factory that fills a man's lungs with dust until a simple cold becomes something that doesn't let go. Historians argue about which factor weighs most: contagion, environment, nutrition, crowding, and you suspect the answer is that the city stacks them together, then asks the poor to carry the pile. By evening, you find yourself back on a main avenue. The lamps come on again, and the city returns to its nighttime face, as if it has 2 separate personalities, and both are equally demanding. You pause beside a street corner, watching the horse car glide through its familiar line of light and shadow. Your hands ache faintly from cold and from work. Your bag feels heavier than leather and glass should feel. And yet, as you stand there, you notice something almost tender. A passerby holds a scarf up over a child's mouth against the wind. A neighbor shoulders a bucket of coal for an older woman without making a show of it. Someone laughs briefly at a joke you don't catch, and the sound lifts for a moment above the grind of the city, like a small bird refusing to leave for warmer places. You turn your collar up, breathe shallowly to spare your throat, and start toward the next address, following the rails' faint shine as if the street itself is pointing you onward, one winter lung after another, one door after another, through a season that seems determined to test how gently you can keep speaking. You come out of the winter streets with your collar turned high, your breath still faintly visible, and you follow the warmth the way anyone does in New York toward lighted windows, toward places that smell like something other than cold stone and coal smoke. A druggist's shop announces itself before you even read a sign. It has that particular scent: sharp spirits, dried herbs, soap, and something sweet underneath, like licorice or syrup. The window is crowded with bottles, glass catching the gaslight in pale, steady glints, labels in tidy lettering, promises arranged like little soldiers. Inside, the air is warmer, and the quiet feels almost moral, like a library that happens to sell relief. You step in, and the bell over the door gives a small, bright sound. Behind the counter, a man in a stained apron looks up from his work. His hands are dusted with powder, and he holds himself with the careful focus of someone who measures the world in grains and drops. Mortars sit on shelves, pestles worn smooth by repetition. Drawers are labelled in a private language of Latin and habit. This is not the dramatic medicine of a crowded ward, it's the patient, domestic chemistry of the city. In the 19th century, pharmacy is becoming a profession in its own right. Even if the lines still blur, New York has had apothecaries for generations. But by 1829, the New York College of Pharmacy is founded, part of a wider push to formalize training and standards. You can feel that shift in shops like this, half trade, half science, and fully embedded in everyday life. People may fear hospitals and hesitate to call a doctor, but they will step into a druggist's shop with far less ceremony. The counter is approachable. The bottles look orderly. The prices, sometimes, are at least imaginable. You set your bag down gently, as if it might bruise the quiet. The druggist greets you with a nod that says you're not a stranger here. You're part of the same weary ecosystem. You both work with imperfect tools and heavy expectations. You both know the city's appetite for cures is endless, and its patience for illness is short. A woman stands at the counter with a small child wrapped in a shawl. The child's eyes are half-lidded, face flushed. The woman's voice is hushed but urgent. She wants something for the cough, something to let the child sleep, something to give her just for a night the feeling that she's doing more than waiting. The druggist listens, and his gaze flicks briefly to you, the unspoken question passing between professionals. How much do we say? How much do we sell? Because the shelves are full of answers, and not all answers are kind. In this era, medicines move through the city in many forms. Some are compounded here, measured and mixed in small batches, powders, syrups, tinctures, tailored to a prescription or to a familiar complaint. Others arrive already branded, already bottled, already speaking in the confident voice of advertising. Panaceas, bitters, sarsaparillas, soothing syrups, miracle cures. The language is grand, almost biblical in its certainty. It promises not merely relief, but transformation. You watch the woman's eyes drift, despite herself, toward the display. Her gaze lingers the way a thirsty person looks at water. This is one of the city's gentler traps. When hope is sold by the ounce, you do not shame her for wanting it. Wanting it is human. In a cramped tenement with a sick child, the temptation of a bottle that claims to restore vitality or quiet all irritation can feel like a lifeline. And when doctors are expensive or distant and institutions feel cold, these bottles become a kind of folk faith, bright glass icons lined up in a window. You speak softly, choosing your words the way the druggist chooses his measurements. You explain that some things can soothe without curing, and that sleep can be bought at a cost. You remind her gently, without a sermon, that certain quieting syrups may dull a cough by dulling the body itself, and that what calms can also weaken. You do not list ingredients. You do not turn this into instruction. You simply guide her toward the safer side of the shelf, toward the milder remedies that are less likely to steal tomorrow from her child in exchange for tonight's silence. The druggist, with a small look of relief, offers something modest, perhaps a simple syrup, perhaps a preparation meant to soothe the throat without making grand claims. The woman's shoulders lower a fraction, and she pays with coins that look as if they've been counted twice before being surrendered. She leaves with the child held tight, and the bell over the door rings again like a small exhale. You remain, and now it is your turn to look at the shelves. Some bottles are purely practical things you use and trust within the limits of the century's knowledge. Quinine, for fevers that come and go in patterns. Simple antiseptics that are beginning, slowly, to matter more in everyday practice as ideas about infection gain ground. Ointments, salts, castor oil, charcoal, soap, and then the more dangerous companions, strong purgatives that reflect older medical beliefs about clearing the system. Compounds whose side effects are sometimes as powerful as their intended use. The 19th century is full of treatments that can feel, in hindsight, like a negotiation with the body rather than a partnership with it. You think, too, about the way people medicate themselves in private. Laudanum and paregoric common opiate tinctures of the period sit in some homes, like quiet, respectable secrets, used for pain, for diarrhea, for cough, for sleeplessness. Taken carefully, they can ease suffering. Taken too freely, They can pull a person into dependence with a softness that doesn't look like danger until it's already there. In a city full of labor injuries and chronic strain, the line between relief and reliance can be thin as paper. The druggist moves behind the counter with practiced grace, pulling drawers open, tapping powder onto a scale, watching the needle settle like a thought finally landing. It's a small ritual of precision, and you find it calming. There's something deeply human about wanting the world to be measurable. On one wall, you notice printed pamphlets, little almanacs and handbills stacked for customers to take. This is one of those lesser, quietly documented details of the age. Patent medicine companies often distribute almanacs for free, full of weather predictions and farm tips and jokes, and threaded through with advertisements and testimonials. They enter households as innocent calendars and become, in a way, unofficial medical literature. The city learns about health not only from doctors and sermons, but from the cheerful paper voice of commerce. You pick one up and flip it open. The claims are broad enough to cover any life: fatigue, nerves, weak digestion, aches of age, sadness that won't lift. It's tempting, you think, because it speaks to what's real. People are tired. People are strained. People want an explanation that doesn't require them to admit how hard their lives are. And here, in the quiet of the shop, you feel a question that keeps returning like a slow tide. What is the difference between being healed and being comforted? Historians still argue about the patent medicine era, whether these widely sold remedies were mostly fraud preying on the vulnerable, or whether they also provided a kind of early consumer access to symptom relief in a world with limited medical care. The truth, as usual, seems to live in the uncomfortable middle. Some preparations genuinely soothe, many exaggerate, some harm, and the entire market thrives in the gaps left by poverty, uneven access, and a profession still building its standards. You and the druggist speak in low tones about supplies. He mentions prices rising for certain imported ingredients, the way war or shipping delays can ripple into the simplest household remedy. You trade observations like weather reports, coughs everywhere, fevers in clusters, stomach troubles near certain streets. This is another quiet fact of city medicine. The druggist is often an unofficial epidemiologist, hearing the neighborhood's ailments before the newspapers do. A man enters and asks, almost casually, for a tonic. He doesn't say what for. He doesn't have to. In a city like this, tonics are for the general condition of being worn down. The druggist offers something, and you watch the man's expression soften with relief as soon as he holds the bottle, as if the mere weight of it is reassurance. You want to tell him that the best tonic is time, rest, clean air, decent food, and less fear, but you can't hand those over the counter. You can only watch the city find substitutes. When you step back outside, the cold meets you again, and the street feels louder than it did a moment ago. A horse car rattles by, sparks of sound on iron rails. A gust of wind lifts a scrap of paper and tumbles it along the curb like a little fleeing animal. Your bag hangs at your side, but now you feel the druggist's shelves in your mind too. Rows of promises, measured powders, bright glass hopes. You walk on with a steadier understanding of what you are up against. Not only disease, but the vast marketplace of comfort, the hunger for certainty, the way a city will always try to buy its way out of fear. And somewhere ahead, you know, another door is already half open, waiting for your footsteps on the stairs. The next place you go has a different smell than the druggist's tidy shop. It smells of soap that's trying its best, of damp stone and boiled linens, of old wood scrubbed so often it has lost its softness. It smells, too, of nerves, human nerves, because this is where people come when the body is no longer willing to wait politely. You enter a hospital building and feel the air change around you, cooler in the corridors, echoing under high ceilings. In 19th-century New York, hospitals are not yet the gleaming, modern temples of medicine they will become. They are busy, imperfect institutions, and for many working families they are places of last resort. To be admitted can feel like surrender. To avoid admission can feel like pride. You move past a doorway and glimpse a ward. Beds in a row, white sheets, Faces turned toward windows or turned away from everything. In some hospitals, separation by class and by gender shapes the rooms. In all of them, overcrowding is a constant pressure, like a hand on the shoulder. You hear a low murmur of voices, nurses, attendants, patients, and the occasional sharp call when something goes wrong. And then you notice the thing that, in this era, sits in the background of every surgical space like a shadow: pain. For centuries, the knife has been a weapon people endured awake. Surgery was speed and restraint, and grit, an ordeal that tested not only the patient's body, but their courage and the surgeon's ability to work fast. Even in the early 19th century, surgeons trained their hands to be swift, partly because they had to, because every extra minute was another minute of raw suffering. Then the world changed in a way that still feels, to you, like a quiet miracle. You think of the mid-1840 seconds, when ether anesthesia begins to spread, famously demonstrated publicly in Boston in 1846, and then rapidly discussed, adopted, argued over, and refined. Chloroform follows soon after, introduced into medical practice in the late 1840 seconds. The news moves through professional circles like a spark, a way to take away the worst part of the knife, to separate surgery from terror. By the time you are walking these New York corridors, anesthesia is no longer a rumor. It is a tool used carefully, debated constantly, and still edged with risk. It doesn't erase danger, but it changes what is possible. It changes the tone of the room. It changes the meaning of a hospital. You arrive at a small operating space, nothing like the modern theatre, but still a place set aside where light can reach and instruments can be laid out. The surgeon you work with has that particular posture of confidence that comes from repetition and from being treated by society as a man who wrestles death and sometimes wins. In the 19th century, surgeons carry a certain public aura, part craftsman, part daredevil, part authority figure. Their pride can be earned, but it can also harden into arrogance. You've seen both. Today's case is not some grand, dramatic spectacle. It's the kind of ordinary catastrophe that the city produces every day. A workplace injury, a crushed hand, a bad fracture, something that will not heal properly without intervention. The patient is a working man. Most are, because the city's machines and scaffolds and wagons take their toll. His face is pale, eyes darting, breath quick with fear. He tries to hide behind jokes. You stand near his head and speak softly. You tell him what will happen in the plainest, gentlest terms you can. In this era, consent is not always handled the way later generations will insist it must be. Families may not be fully informed. Patients may not understand the risks. Authority can slide too easily into command. You try, within the customs of your time, to offer clarity rather than mystery. Fear grows in darkness. The anesthetic is prepared ether, its sharp, sweet odor already rising. You watch the cloth and the bottle, the careful measurement of drops, the way everyone's demeanor tightens. Ether can be a blessing, but it's not a toy. People can struggle, vomit, breathe poorly. The line between asleep and too far is not always obvious, especially before later refinements and monitoring methods. The room becomes quiet in the way a storm becomes quiet right before it breaks. The cloth is brought close. The patient inhales, coughs once, then again. Then his eyes begin to lose their focus. He tries to speak some half joke, half prayer, but it dissolves into a soft, confused sound. His muscles tense, then slacken. His breathing changes. The terror that was shining in his eyes a moment ago fades, replaced by the blank peace of unconsciousness. It is astonishing. Every time. A man who would have screamed and thrashed under the knife is now still. The knife can now be slower, more precise. The surgeon can take time to do the work properly, not just quickly. You feel, in your own body, how the entire moral atmosphere of surgery shifts. Pain is no longer the unavoidable price of intervention. It is something you can try to remove. And yet, even as anesthesia offers mercy, another danger remains stubborn and silent. Infection. You have seen too many patients survive the cutting, only to be claimed afterward by fever, suppuration, hospital gangrene. or other post-operative horrors that people speak about in grim euphemisms. In the middle of the century, before antiseptic methods become widespread, hospitals can be breeding grounds for infection. The very place designed to heal can also harm. This is one of the cruel paradoxes of early institutional medicine. Concentrating the sick can concentrate disease. You can sense change coming, though. The later decades of the century will see the rise of antiseptic ideas, associated especially with Joseph Lister's work in the 1860 seconds, gradually transforming surgical practice. But in many places, adoption is uneven and debated. Some surgeons embrace new methods, others resist, skeptical of theory, attached to habit, or simply unwilling to admit they might have been causing harm. Historians still discuss how quickly these practices spread in America, how hospital culture and individual personalities shaped the pace of change. In this room, today, you see small attempts at cleanliness, hands washed, linens boiled, instruments wiped, not the full antiseptic regime the future will demand, but hints that the profession is beginning to suspect that invisible dangers matter as much as visible ones. The surgeon works. Metal catches the light. A basin waits. A nurse's hands move with quick competence. You focus on the patient's breathing, the color of his lips, the rise and fall of his chest. You learn, over time, to watch the body as a whole, not only the wound. Under ether, the body becomes a sea you must read. Too shallow, too deep, too irregular, too still. The procedure ends. The wound is dressed. The patient begins to stir, face tightening as consciousness returns like a tide. He coughs and grimaces, eyes fluttering open with confusion. The room's tension releases slightly, like a held breath finally allowed out. He is alive. He is intact. He has been spared the worst of pain. It feels, in the moment, like progress you can touch. But you don't let yourself become sentimental. The next days will matter. The wound must not fester. The fever must not climb. The ward must not swallow him in its crowded air. You give instructions, keep the dressing clean, watch for swelling, watch for heat and redness. Return if there is discharge. Return if the patient grows weak or delirious. You speak in a calm voice, trying to make the future feel manageable. Outside the operating space, you pass another room where students stand in a cluster, eager eyes bright. Medical education in the 19th century is changing, too. Hospitals become learning grounds. The presence of students can be a boon. More hands, more observation, more knowledge circulating. But it can also feel intrusive to patients who are already vulnerable. You catch a student's gaze and remember yourself at the start. Hungry to learn, not yet fully aware that every case is a person. As you leave the hospital later, the city outside seems almost indecently alive. Vendors call out. Wheels roll. A child laughs. It's as if the street is pretending it has never heard of suffering. You step onto the sidewalk and pull your coat tighter. The smell of ether lingers faintly in your memory, like a ghost of sweetness. The image of the patient's face fearful, then blank, then waking sits quietly behind your eyes. And you carry with you the paradox of this era. Medicine is gaining astonishing powers, mercy against pain, instruments that extend the hand, institutions that gather knowledge, while still fighting a war against unseen infection, with weapons that are only just being forged. You walk on, because New York's next demand is already approaching, and the city rarely gives you long enough to admire what has changed. The hospital's corridors fall away behind you, and the city takes you back like a tide reclaiming a footprint. The street air feels rougher after ether less sweet, more honest coal smoke and damp brick, and the faint bite of winter sunlight bouncing off dirty snow. You walk without hurrying, because your body has learned that rushing too often is just another way of arriving exhausted. Your bag swings at your side with that steady, practical thump, and the sound becomes a metronome for your thoughts. There are certain subjects you try not to carry home with you at night. You don't dwell on how many fevers you've watched rise. You don't count the coughs. You don't replay the worst outcomes like a private punishment. But one subject keeps returning, no matter how you try to set it down. Bodies. Not only living bodies, the ones you can still warm, still soothe, still guide back to steadier breathing, but dead bodies too. And the strange, uneasy relationship the 19th century city has with them. New York is growing so quickly that even death feels crowded. As you cross a busier avenue, you pass a group of men unloading crates, laughing about something you can't hear. The laughter is easy, ordinary, and you feel a small pang of envy. Then you see, tucked just beyond them, the notice board outside a medical school or a lecture hall plain, respectable, announcing an anatomy demonstration, an educational event, the kind of thing that sounds calm in print and complicated in practice. Anatomy is the foundation of your profession. You know that. Every tendon, every organ, every hidden corridor of the body. This knowledge is not decorative. It's essential. Surgery, diagnosis, even the ability to explain illness without superstition depends on it. And yet, the path to that knowledge is littered with scandal. In the early decades of the century, New York, like many cities, lives with the shadow of body snatching, the practice of resurrection men, stealing corpses from graves to sell to medical schools. It is one of those historical realities that people tell as a lurid story, but it's also an economic system. Medical training demands cadavers, the law restricts legal access, and someone fills the gap with shovels. Public outrage is fierce, and for good reason. In a city where wealth already protects the living, it can also seem to protect the dead. The poor are buried in less secure ground, sometimes in potters' fields or cramped graveyards, and their bodies become more vulnerable to theft. Fear of dissection is not only squeamishness. For many, it's a fear of being stripped of dignity even after life has already stripped you of everything else. You remember stories that older colleagues tell with a kind of grim caution about riots sparked by rumors that bodies were being stolen, about crowds attacking anatomy rooms, about communities guarding graves. In New York, the most famous early flashpoint is the Doctors' Riot of 1788, decades before your current moment, when anger over alleged grave robbing exploded into violence. Even though that event is long past, its memory lingers like a warning. Meddle with the dead, and the living may come for you. By the time you are practicing, laws begin to shift slowly. New York State's Anatomy Act of 1854 is one such turning point, aiming to provide legal cadavers, often the unclaimed dead, from institutions, rather than leaving schools to rely on theft. On paper, it is reform. In practice, it raises its own ethical weight. If the bodies come from the unclaimed, then poverty and isolation still decide who becomes a specimen. Consent is still murky. Justice is still uneven. It is a change, but not a clean one. You don't lecture the street about this. You simply carry the tension inside you, the knowledge that your profession needs bodies to learn, and the discomfort with how society decides whose bodies can be taken. Tonight, that tension becomes personal. A knock arrives in the form of a messenger, breathless, hat tilted, cheeks red from running. He finds you near a corner and speaks quickly, as if the words are too heavy to hold. There has been an incident near a small burial ground. People are angry. They want a doctor, not for healing, but for answers. Or perhaps they want someone to blame and assume doctor is close enough. You follow, not because you expect to calm a crowd with your bag, but because crowds can turn dangerous when fear has found a target. You know this city's history. You know how rumor becomes flame. As you approach, you hear it. Voices layered, tense, rising and falling like waves hitting rocks. You see a cluster of people near a churchyard gate, men with caps pulled low, women with shawls tight around their shoulders, a few children peering between adult bodies. Someone points toward the ground, toward disturbed earth, toward a patch of soil that looks freshly worked in a way it shouldn't. A woman's voice trembles as she speaks. Her cousin, buried last week. The grave looks wrong. The earth looks as if it has been opened. Her words are not polished, they are raw. Around her, anger stiffens faces, and you can feel how quickly the crowd is constructing a story. Theft, disrespect, rich men stealing from the poor, Science feeding on those who have no power. You step forward slowly, palms open, posture calm. You do not announce yourself like an official. You simply speak in a low voice that invites the group to lean in rather than surge forward. You ask what they saw, who noticed first, whether anyone touched anything. You look at the ground with careful attention, not because you're a detective, but because you understand what the scene represents to them. Not soil, but dignity. You cannot prove, on the spot, what happened. You are not a magistrate. You are not the law. But you can offer the one thing the crowd doesn't have yet: a pause. You tell them, gently, that disturbed soil can have other causes: animals, weather, settling ground, but you do not dismiss their fear. Dismissal is gasoline. You acknowledge the city's history without turning it into a confession. You say, in plain words, that medical schools have had a shameful relationship with graveyards, and that laws have been changing to reduce that. You do not say, trust us. You say, instead, let's find out what's true. Some faces soften slightly, others remain hard. This is the interpretive line you can't escape. Even when reform comes, trust comes slower. Historians still argue about whether laws like the Anatomy Act truly ended illicit trade everywhere, or whether they simply shifted it and reshaped it. From the street's view, what matters is not legislation, but lived experience. Who gets protected? Who gets taken? A man near the gate spits onto the ground an angry punctuation and says he's heard of bodies taken from institutions too, the unclaimed pulled into science because no one has money to mourn them properly. His voice has the cracked edge of grief, pretending to be rage. You don't correct him. In the broader sense, he's not wrong. You offer to go with them to the local authorities, to file a complaint, to request an investigation. You offer to write a statement, simple, factual, about what you observed. These are small gestures, but small gestures can be the difference between a crowd dispersing and a crowd deciding to become a mob. Slowly, the tension loosens. People mutter, still angry, but the wave breaks into smaller ripples. Someone takes the grieving woman's arm and guides her away from the gate. A few men remain, staring at the ground as if the soil has insulted them personally. You stand there a moment longer, letting your presence be steady and uninteresting. Eventually, even anger grows bored. When you leave, the cold feels sharper, and the city's lamps seem a little harsher, as if every flame has learned the same lesson. Light can attract attention, and attention can turn violent when it feels betrayed. You walk on, and you think of your students in their lecture halls, eager for knowledge, and of the families who fear that knowledge requires stealing what little dignity they have. You think of how medicine, in this century, is both rising in power and struggling to earn moral legitimacy. Your bag swings at your side. It contains tools for the living, yet tonight it feels haunted by the dead. And as you head back toward the busier streets, you notice something quietly symbolic. A church bell ringing in the distance, not for outrage now, but simply to mark the hour time moving forward. Regardless of whether the city's conscience has caught up with its ambitions, you keep moving through the city as if your feet have learned a second profession, part doctor, part cartographer, mapping New York by the places where people get hurt. Not the dramatic hurts that make headlines, but the small, daily ones that never become legend. A finger pinched in a door that closes too fast. A hand scraped raw by rope. A fall that bruises ribs and pride. A burn from a stove that flares up when someone is too tired to be careful. A cough that worsens because a man keeps going to work, keeps breathing dust, keeps pretending his body is not a body at all, only a tool. This is how the city feeds itself, with motion, with labor, with the constant conversion of human energy into money, buildings, newspapers, and steam. On a bright afternoon that is colder than it looks, you stand near a corner where the street feels like a crossroads of occupations. Wagons rattle past with crates. A shopkeeper leans out to call to a supplier. A boy darts through the traffic with a bundle of papers under his arm, shouting the news like a small brass instrument. Another boy, smaller, follows him with a quick, practiced glance. At every adult, face an expert at spotting a buyer, an expert at spotting danger. The newsboys, newsies, some call them, belong to the street, in a way that is hard to explain to anyone who has never tried to earn coins in the open air. They are not exactly employees in the modern sense. They hustle, they buy papers, sell papers, keep what they can, lose what they can't. Later, in 1899, many of these children will organize a strike against the powerful newspapers of Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst when the terms feel unfair, and the city will be forced briefly to notice them as something other than background noise. Wikipedia, +1. But tonight, you see them simply as children in a grown city, quick, thin, and brave in that very New York way, where courage is sometimes just the inability to afford fear. One of them slips on slush, catches himself on the curb, and sits up with a sharp inhale. He tries to laugh it off for his friends, but you see him press his palm to his knee, as if checking whether the bone is still loyal. You crouch beside him and ask, gently, to see. He hesitates, because accepting help can feel like losing a game. Then he holds his knee out, face turned away, as if he's allowing assistance without admitting it. The scrape is shallow, but the cold makes everything sting more. You clean it as best you can with what you carry, wrap it quickly, and tell him softly, like a secret, that the real job is keeping it from turning nasty later. He looks at you with the suspicious gratitude of someone who has learned that kindness can come with strings. When he realizes you're not asking for anything, his shoulders loosen. He's already halfway back to his feet, papers under his arm again, the street calling him like it owns his name. You watch him go and feel the quiet ache behind your ribs. The city will keep taking small bites out of him, day after day, until he's old enough to be swallowed by larger work. And larger work is everywhere. In the garment districts and the cramped lofts where sewing machines clatter like insects. Hands move fast and eyes strain under poor light. In cigar shops, sometimes even in tenement rooms, when work spills into home, people sit for hours, shoulders tight, fingers stained, lungs sharing whatever the room gives them. In printing rooms, heavy presses breathe in and out with mechanical certainty, and a moment's distraction can mean a crushed fingertip or a hand pulled where it shouldn't go. In warehouses and on docks, ropes burn skin, barrels roll, crates slip, and backs learn the shape of permanent strain. You make your rounds like a tide that returns to the same shore. A factory foreman sends for you because a young woman has fainted at her station. When you arrive, she is sitting up again, cheeks pale, eyes bright with embarrassment. Around her, machines keep moving, because machines do not pause for human dignity. You ask about breakfast, about sleep, about the heat in the room, about the hours. Her answers come out in small, careful pieces. Not enough food, too little air, too many days strung together without rest. You advise what you can water, food, slower rising, a moment outside if she's allowed, but you can't prescribe a shorter workday. You can only name the problem in a voice gentle enough that it doesn't sound like blame. You treat a man who comes in with a bandaged hand and a story that keeps changing. First, it's a small accident. Then, it's a bigger one. Then, finally, it's the truth. A supervisor told him not to make trouble, and he's afraid of losing his job if he admits how it happened. You see the bruised shape of fear wrapped around his injury like an extra layer of cloth. You treat the hand anyway clean. Bandage. Caution him against pushing it too soon, while knowing he will push it too soon, because rent does not care about healing. This is the quiet arithmetic of industrial New York. Bodies are cheaper than safety, until reformers manage to make safety cheaper than outrage. You hear talk of regulations and inspectors, of law slowly turning its face toward factories. In heavily industrialized New York State, a factory inspection law arrives in 1886. At first focused largely on the employment of women and children, and then expanding in scope over time, one of those early attempts to make the city and state responsible for more than commerce. DOL, +2. New York State Archives, +2. But even as the paperwork grows, the daily reality remains stubborn. Enforcement is uneven, and the city's pace is relentless. Historians still argue about how much early legislation truly changed working conditions versus how much it simply marked the beginning of a longer, slower fight. And sometimes, in the middle of all these small hurts, something happens that feels bigger than a bruise. One evening, you are called toward the river again, not to the islands this time, but to a construction site where the city is building one of its proudest future symbols, the Brooklyn Bridge. Work began in 1869, and for years the bridge rises by sheer stubbornness, stone, steel, and human bodies turned into architecture. You do not see the bridge as a postcard. You see it as scaffolds, muddy boots, shouted instructions, and men climbing where the air itself feels like a risk. A worker is brought to you alive, conscious, frightened in a way that doesn't fit a simple cut. He is dizzy, nauseated, complaining that his joints ache, as if something invisible has twisted them. His speech is slow, as if his mouth has forgotten its usual cooperation. Someone nearby mutters a phrase you've been hearing more often around big underwater projects. Caisson disease. Down in the pressurized caissons beneath the river, men labor in conditions that feel almost unearthly, breathing compressed air, digging through mud, enduring heat and headaches, and that strange sense of the world pressing back. When they come up too quickly, their bodies react with baffling violence, pain, weakness, confusion. Even seasoned engineers and doctors argue about the exact mechanism in these early years. But the pattern is undeniable. The bridge's chief engineer, Washington Roebling, is famously afflicted and spends years managing the project from a distance afterward. A living reminder that modern triumphs have modern costs. You sit with the worker and keep your voice slow. You help him lie still. You encourage warmth, rest, quiet. You watch his eyes and his breath, because in this era, you do more watching than fixing. You feel the helpless anger that comes when the injury is born from the very progress the city celebrates. Outside, the bridge's stone tower rises against the sky like a promise. Inside, in the lamplight, a man tries to remember what it felt like to stand without the room swaying. As you leave that site, the city's scale hits you in a new way. The streets, the factories, the docks, the printing rooms, the sewing floors, each one is a small engine. Together, they are a machine so vast that it can build wonders, and so indifferent that it can grind people into quiet suffering without even noticing the sound. And yet, in the same night, you find yourself back on a familiar staircase, treating a very ordinary injury, a kitchen burn, a sliced thumb, a child's scraped chin from tripping over a wash basin. These are the small injuries that don't belong to industry alone. They belong to life. You wrap a bandage with careful fingers, and the family watches with the same reverence they gave you on the worst nights. You offer one small, gentle joke, something about New York insisting on collecting a little blood from everyone who lives in it, and you hear a tired laugh flutter up like a bird. You step back out into the street. Somewhere, a press is still running, a sewing machine still clattering, a dock still unloading, a newsboy still calling the headlines into the cold. The city is making tomorrow out of people's hands. You tighten your grip on your bag and keep walking, because you know what comes next. The way work and politics and fear can spill into the streets, and how old unrest can leave a taste that never quite fades. You walk into the next stretch of the city with a sensation you've come to recognize, like the air itself is holding its breath. Some days, New York feels merely busy, loud, impatient, hungry. But on other days, the city feels watchful, as if every corner has learned to remember. You can sense it in the way people talk a little lower on stoops, in the way shopkeepers stand a little closer to their doorways, in the way a patrolman's hand rests near his belt, not because he expects trouble in this exact minute, but because the city has taught him that trouble can appear like a match struck in wind. You don't need anyone to tell you which memory sits behind this mood. The city still carries the aftertaste of 1863, the draft riots, like smoke that clings long after a fire is out. Even when the streets look calm, you can feel where the old heat ran, block to block, crowd to crowd, rumor to rumor. You've heard the stories 100 ways. Everyone has their version, shaped by which street they were on, which door they hid behind, which neighbor they lost trust in, which neighbor surprised them with kindness. But certain anchors remain solid, impossible to smooth down. The Civil War is still the great, grinding presence in the background, pulling men southward and pulling grief back home. And in 1863, the federal government's Enrollment Act conscription lands in New York like a stone dropped in a crowded room. The draft feels, to many working men, like a sentence handed down by people who will never pay it themselves. The clause that allows a drafted man to hire a substitute or pay a commutation fee of $300 becomes a symbol as sharp as any knife, a way for the wealthy to step aside while the poor are pushed forward. You can feel that injustice simmering even years later, because the city's class tensions don't politely end when legislation changes. They settle into the mortar between buildings. And then there is the other truth, darker and more painful. The violence of that week in July is not only about war and money, it is also about race. Black New Yorkers, already living with constant threats and prejudice, become targets of rage, scapegoated in the ugliest way, blamed, hunted, brutalized. The city's conscience, if it has one, does not come out looking clean. You don't think of these things as headlines. You think of them as roots. Because as a street doctor, you don't have the luxury of avoiding tense neighborhoods. Illness does not check a political map before it chooses a doorway. A cut hand bleeds the same in a wealthy parlor and a crowded tenement. A fever rises without caring who voted for what. A frightened mother will still send for you even if the street outside has become a place where a wrong glance can turn into trouble. Today, you feel that old tension beneath the surface as you move through Lower Manhattan. You pass a group of men arguing near a curb, voices tight. You catch phrases about wages, about fairness, about men who don't understand what it means to be hungry. Their words are not necessarily about the draft anymore, but the shape of the anger is familiar. It's the same muscle flexing, ready to clench. At the next corner, you notice how the city's authority shows itself. Police are more visible. Their presence is meant to reassure, but it can also inflame. In New York, power has always been complicated, split between local politics, policing, state influence, and, in the worst moments, the arrival of soldiers who look at the streets like a battlefield they didn't choose. During the draft riots, troops are eventually brought in to restore order after the city's own forces are overwhelmed. People remember that. Some remember it with gratitude, some with bitterness, many with both. You keep your eyes forward and your posture unprovocative, the way you've learned to move through spaces that might ignite. Your bag marks you as someone with a role, but not necessarily a safe one. Some people see doctor and think help. Some see doctor and think authority, institution, someone aligned with the powerful. It depends on who is looking and what their week has been like. A runner finds you near a small market breathless, cheeks flushed, voice hurried. There has been a fight. Nothing like the riots, he insists quickly, as if he's afraid of conjuring that scale by speaking it. Just a brawl, he says, but his eyes are wide, and you can tell he's not only worried about the injured, Hess worried about what the injured might attract. A crowd, an argument, a chance for old grievances to rehearse themselves again. You follow him. The street you enter is not chaos, not yet, it's a knot, a tight cluster of bodies, ringed by onlookers who pretend they're only passing by. A few men stand with arms crossed, faces stern. Someone is shouting, words indistinct. Someone else is trying to calm him, voice low and urgent. The energy crackles, not like celebration, but like dry air before a storm. You make your way in with a calm you've learned to wear like armor. On the ground sits a young man, holding his head, blood dark against his hairline. Not a flood, not a spectacle, just enough to make him pale, and to make everyone around him talk too loudly about what they would have done. His friend crouches beside him, insisting he's fine, insisting he doesn't need help, insisting above all that nobody should make this into a thing. You kneel. You speak softly. You ask the injured man to look at you. His pupils respond. His breath is steady. His eyes are angry with pain more than fear. You clean the wound as best you can, your hands practiced, your movements small and precise. You wrap it, and you instruct him to rest, to watch for dizziness, to return if he vomits or becomes confused. He scoffs, because scoffing is a way of pretending you aren't scared. As you work, you notice the crowd's mood shifting, not toward relief, exactly, but toward a kind of frustrated deflation, like someone wanted drama and you gave them calm instead. It won't last forever. It rarely does. But you take what you can get. You stand and look around, meeting eyes briefly, without challenge. You nod to a patrolman who has arrived at the edge of the crowd, his presence both a boundary and a spark. The patrolman nods back, and you both silently agree. Let this dissolve. Let the city keep its peace for one more hour. The crowd loosens. People drift away, muttering. The street resumes its usual motion, as if nothing happened, but you feel the tremor underneath, the way you feel a faint shiver in a bridge after a heavy cart has passed. As you walk on, your mind returns to the riot stories you cannot fully escape. You think of how quickly a protest against conscription became something larger and uglier. You think of neighborhoods where people hid, not only from violence, but from betrayal, because in riots, danger can come not only from strangers, but from familiar faces swept up in the crowd's fever. You think of Black New Yorkers who learned, again, that the city could turn on them in a heartbeat. You think of institutions attacked and burned, including the colored orphan asylum, an image that haunts the moral memory of that week like a candle that will not go out. You also think, quietly, of the ways people help one another in such moments, even when history doesn't always linger on it. Neighbors pulling families into safer rooms, strangers guiding children through side streets, clergy and community leaders trying to cool tempers. The city contains brutality, yes, but it also contains small acts of protection that resist being erased. Historians still argue about what drove the draft riots most: class resentment over the commutation clause, opposition to the war, political manipulation, racism, economic fear, and the combustible density of the city itself. Standing here now, you suspect it's not one cause but a pile of causes stacked too high. The riot is what happens when the pile collapses. Your work sits uncomfortably in the middle of all this. You are called to bodies harmed by politics, and called to bodies harmed by poverty, and you cannot always separate the two. A wound from a fist is still a wound. A bruise from a baton still aches. A fever still rises in a room where the rent is overdue. Sometimes you treat the injury and feel like you're putting a cloth over a deeper fire. Late in the day, you climb another staircase because the city always returns you to stairs, and you step into a room where the tension is quieter but no less real. A mother asks you to look at her child's rash, but her eyes keep flicking to the window as if she expects shouting outside. She says she doesn't like the way men have been gathering on the corner again. She says she doesn't like the way the police look at her husband when he comes home from work. She says, almost in a whisper, that she's tired of feeling like the street might decide their fate. You examine the child gently. The rash is mild, likely from irritation, poor ventilation, winter cloth. You offer simple guidance and reassurance, but you also hear what she is really asking. Is this city safe for us? You cannot answer that in medicine, so you answer it the only way you can, by making your presence steady, by letting your voice be kind, by treating them as fully human, without moral accounting, without suspicion. You hand the mother a small instruction and a smaller hope, that not every authority figure arrives to judge, that not every knock on the door means danger. When you leave, the sky has deepened into evening. Gas lamps bloom again along the avenues, soft halos in the damp air. The city looks almost gentle under that light, as if it's trying to forget what it has done. You walk on, feeling the old unrest like a faint ache in the bones of the streets, and you know that the next chapter of your work won't be fought only in stairwells and sick rooms. It will be fought in the cities, public decisions too, in sanitation and reform, in the slow, stubborn attempt to make New York healthier, not just by treating bodies, but by changing the world those bodies have to live inside. You feel the city changing in small, practical ways before anyone puts a grand name on it. Not in speeches first, not in parade banners, but in the stubborn details. A new pile of paving stones, waiting at a corner, a crew scraping muck from a gutter, a notice pasted near a tenement doorway with official language that sounds almost offended by the smell it describes. You walk past a street where the curb is lined with refuse vegetable peelings, ashes, broken crates, scraps. The horses have stepped through and spread like a grim confetti, and you notice how people's faces tighten when they look at it now. A decade ago, many might have shrugged. That's the city, they would have said, as if filth were simply a tax for living near opportunity. But after cholera seasons, after long runs of fever and infant sickness, after the slow understanding that bad air might not be the whole story, the shrug begins to look less acceptable. The city's tolerance wears thin, and reform creeps in not like a trumpet blast, but like a broom pushed steadily across stone. You become, without ever applying for the title, part of a public argument, because you are the one who climbs the stairs and sees the back rooms where the air does not move. You are the one who smells the damp that lives in the plaster. You are the one who hears the coughs that return every winter as reliably as the first frost. You are the one who watches a child's diarrhea turn frightening in a home where clean water is a rumor, not a faucet. When the city forms new boards and passes new laws, those words on paper eventually drift into your daily life in the form of inspectors, men with notebooks, and a hard set to their mouths, men who look like they are trying not to breathe too deeply. They knock on doors and measure the unmeasurable. How many people in one room? How much air in a hallway? How close a privy sits to a water source? How often a landlord bothers to fix anything at all? Sometimes you welcome them, sometimes you dread them, because reform has two faces. One is help, the other is judgment. You have seen the way the poorest families are already treated, as if their poverty is a personal flaw, and you fear that sanitation, this morally righteous crusade for cleanliness, can turn into another excuse to shame the very people least able to change their conditions. It is easy to demand fresh air from a family whose window opens onto a brick wall. It is easy to demand no crowding from a household where one wage barely covers rent for a single room. Still, you cannot deny what is also true. When streets are cleaner, fewer children fall ill. When waste is managed better, the city's worst fevers ease their grip. When water is safer, panic has less fuel. You feel that truth in your work like a quiet lowering of the tide. There are days when you accompany a health officer officially or unofficially because the city wants a doctor's eyes on a trouble spot. You walk into a block where the gutters run dark, where the smell clings to clothing long after you leave. You hear the residents complain, not with laziness, but with exhaustion. The landlord refuses repairs, the privy overflows, the cellar floods, the street outside is never cleaned, and the children are always sick. You stand in the hallway and look at the ceiling stains, the damp climbing the walls, the narrow windows that barely open. You think of how the city built itself too fast, and now is trying, belatedly, to pretend it meant to do it properly all along. Tenement reform becomes one of the most stubborn battlegrounds. Laws begin to demand certain basics: ventilation, fire escapes, minimal sanitation, though the exact standards, and how well they are enforced, shift over the decades. You hear people speak about rear tenements, those buildings tucked behind other buildings, where light and air are treated like optional luxuries. You see how families live in interior rooms that never feel truly daytime, where lamps burn even at noon and the air tastes used. You walk through such a place and feel anger rise in you, not the hot anger of a riot, but the cold anger of recognition. You have spent too many nights treating illness that is really architecture. You have listened to too many lungs struggling inside rooms built to trap breath. And yet, the city is not only a villain, it is also a machine that can, slowly, be taught. On certain mornings, you pass crews working on sewers, and you watch them like you would watch surgeons. Men going down into the body of the city, into its hidden channels, trying to create paths where waste can move away instead of pooling under everyone's life. Sewer building is not glamorous, but it is revolutionary in its way. It is the city admitting that health is not only a private responsibility, it is civic, shared, structural. You begin to hear reformers speak with a new kind of confidence. They talk about public health as if it were a real thing the government can shape. They talk about sanitation surveys, about maps of disease, about the way certain neighborhoods suffer more and why. They argue about causes: water, crowding, poverty, habits, contagion. And even when they disagree, you sense the shift. The city is learning to look at itself scientifically, not only morally. Some scholars still argue about the motives behind this sanitary movement. Was it pure humanitarian concern? Was it also fear? Fear that disease among the poor would reach the wealthy? Was it a blend of compassion and self-preservation, stitched together into policy? Standing on these streets, you can believe all of it. Humans rarely build reforms out of a single clean motive. They build them out of mixed emotions, and then pretend afterward it was always noble. In the middle of these changes, your own daily routine begins to include odd new moments. A family asks you, very seriously, whether they should keep the window cracked at night. They heard someone say fresh air prevents sickness. You can almost smile at how a phrase travels from a lecture hall to a newspaper to a tenement room and becomes an instruction that someone tries to apply like a charm. You answer carefully, yes, air matters, but not at the cost of freezing a sick child, not when the wind blows in like a knife and the bed is already too thin. You suggest small, realistic shifts, airing the room when weather allows, keeping smoke down, washing cloths, separating drinking water from anything suspect, using sunlight when they can find it. You begin to realize that public health is not only pipes and laws, it's education, it's rumor, it's the slow reshaping of what people consider normal. And then there's the street itself, New York's public stage, where sanitation is always visible. You watch the city argue about street cleaning as if it were a moral referendum. Some residents demand more cleaning crews, others grumble about taxes and nuisance regulations. Shopkeepers complain when inspectors tell them where they can dump waste. Landlords complain when they are forced to make repairs. The poor complain when the only response they receive is a citation or a threat instead of real assistance. You, caught in the middle, keep seeing the same outcome. When the streets are cleaner, the world feels less hopeless. Even if you can't prove every illness is prevented by a swept curb, you can see the emotional truth. Cleanliness becomes a kind of civic reassurance, a sign the city hasn't entirely abandoned its people. Years pass, and the reforms keep coming in uneven waves. You hear about new leadership in sanitation efforts, about a more disciplined approach to street cleaning, about crews organized and trained like a small army against filth. Later in the century, you see something almost theatrical. Street cleaning workers, in pale uniforms, moving through avenues like a quiet parade, turning garbage collection into an image of modern order. It feels like the city finally deciding to take pride in the unglamorous work that keeps children alive. And yet, even as these changes brighten parts of New York, you can't forget how patchy progress can be. One neighborhood gets cleaned first. One street sees repairs, while another is ignored. One landlord complies, another waits until forced. Disease does not vanish. Poverty does not politely step aside. But the city truly begins to accept that health is something it can build, not only something it can pray for. That thought follows you as you climb another familiar staircase, stepping past a bucket of water and a mop leaning against a wall. Small signs that reform has seeped into habit. Someone has been trying. Someone has learned to care about what collects in corners. You knock, you enter, you wash your hands as best you can, and you feel the air in the room still cramped, still imperfect, but perhaps a little less heavy than it used to be. Outside, the city keeps sweeping itself, slowly, stubbornly, as if trying to scrub away its old fevers one street at a time. The city has been sweeping itself, slowly, stubbornly, and you can feel the difference in your nostrils and in your bones. Yet even as gutters are scraped and privies inspected, another kind of cleanliness begins to matter, one that cannot be seen with the eye. No matter how wide you open the window, it arrives in your work the way a new word arrives in a neighborhood, first as a rumor, then as a habit, then as something people insist they always knew. You hear it in the voices of younger doctors, fresh from lectures, coats still too crisp for the streets, who speak with a particular excitement as if the world has finally agreed to be understandable. They talk about germs, about microbes, about specific causes that can be named and hunted. They speak as if disease is no longer a fog, but a set of footprints. Older men, older habits, older theories don't vanish just because a new idea is fashionable. Some still speak, with deep confidence, about miasma and bad air, and you can't entirely blame them. The city does smell, and filth and sickness have long moved together like companions. But now, increasingly, you hear another framing. It isn't the stink itself that kills you. It's what the stink can carry, or what lives invisibly alongside it. And the strange thing is, both views can feel true in the same breath. Bad air may not be the direct villain, but the places with bad air are often the places with crowding, poor water, and endless exposure. The city's old explanations aren't always wrong in their observations, they're wrong in their mechanisms. Historians still argue about how quickly this change in mechanism truly transformed everyday medical practice, because a theory can be proven in a lab and still take decades to become a reflex in a tenement stairwell. Your own shift begins quietly, not in a grand debate, but in a room with a microscope. You step into a medical college building or a hospital's teaching space somewhere with a narrower kind of hush than a church. There is less human drama here, more deliberate attention. Tables, glass, lamps positioned like small suns, the faint chemical smell of stains and preservatives. On one bench sits a row of slides thin, almost nothing yet treated with a seriousness you usually reserve for living bodies. A young man, sleeves rolled, bends over a microscope as if he's trying to listen with his eyes. He adjusts the focus with careful fingertips. Beside him are simple tools that look unimpressive to anyone who hasn't learned to fear what they reveal. Small glass tubes with cotton plugs, a flame for sterilizing loops, bottles of dye that can turn an invisible world into patterns the eye can finally hold. You lean in not to take over, not to pretend you're younger than you are, but to understand what is changing under your feet. He gestures for you to look. You place your eye to the lens, and the world shifts. The field becomes a pale universe, speckled and strange. At first, it seems like nothing, just dots, smears, delicate lines. Then your brain begins to recognize structure. You see that some shapes repeat, some gather, some behave like a crowd. You pull back, blinking, as if you've been staring into sunlight. He speaks softly, almost reverently, about the new bacteriology, about how investigators in Europe, like Louis Pasteur, have been arguing for years that fermentation and disease can be driven by living organisms too small to see unaided. He speaks of Joseph Lister's antiseptic methods and how they've begun to reshape surgery, turning cleanliness from an aesthetic into a weapon. He speaks, too, of Robert Koch's work, how in 1882, Koch announces the identification of the bacillus that causes tuberculosis, giving consumption a specific face at last, a culprit that can be stained, seen, and named. You feel your chest tighten when he says tuberculosis. You think of winter rooms, damp walls, coughing fathers, thin children. You think of how many lives have been lived under the word consumption like a slow curse. And now, in a lens, there is a shape that claims responsibility. It is thrilling. It is horrifying. It is oddly intimate, like learning the true name of a long-feared visitor. The young man talks about stains, how certain dyes make bacteria stand out, how patterns can separate one organism from another. He talks about new methods for growing microbes outside the body, in controlled conditions, ways of coaxing invisible life into something you can study. He speaks with a confidence you envy. You also notice, quietly, that he is still guessing sometimes. The tide is rising, yes, but it's not yet a calm sea. New ideas come with new mistakes. You leave that room carrying a new kind of worry, because if disease has invisible agents, then the city is full of invisible traffic, doorknobs, shared cups, towels used by many hands, spittoons, toys passed from child to child, bedding aired and then brought back inside, the staircase railing polished by thousands of palms. You start to see the city as a network of contact, not just a map of neighborhoods. Your own habits begin to change in small ways that would look almost comical to someone from the early century. You wash your hands more deliberately. Even when the water is cold and scarce, you become more insistent about boiling cloths, about cleaning instruments, about separating what touches one patient from what touches another. You speak more carefully about coughing, about covering mouths, about not spitting on floors, about letting sunlight into rooms when possible. You cannot turn a tenement into a laboratory, but you can plant small practices like seeds. Some patients nod and comply. Others look at you with suspicion, as if you've joined a new religion. And in a way, you have. Not a religion of blind faith, but a religion of invisible certainty. The idea that the world contains forces you cannot see, yet must respect. You hear resistance among colleagues too. Some scoff at laboratory men, claiming real medicine happens at the bedside, not under glass. Some distrust the new confidence, suspecting it will overpromise. Some cling to the old explanations because the old explanations are woven into their identity. You understand that, painfully. It is hard to admit you have been wrong when your livelihood has depended on being right. Historians still argue about whether germ theory's triumph was swift because the evidence was so compelling, or slow because culture and habit are heavy things that do not move just because they are pushed. Living through it, you suspect the answer is both. Compelling evidence, dragging adoption. The city's institutions begin to shift too, as if public health suddenly has a new set of eyes. Where inspectors once judged only filth and crowding, they begin gradually to think in terms of contagion and carriers. You hear talk of laboratories connected to boards of health, of tests and cultures, of identifying specific diseases rather than simply describing symptoms. Even the language in the street begins to change. People start saying germs with a mixture of awe and annoyance, as if they've discovered a new kind of pest they can blame for everything. One afternoon, you are called to a home where a child's throat is dangerously sore, breathing tight, the family terrified. You keep your description gentle, no frightening detail, but you recognize the kind of illness that cities dread because it moves quickly through households. In this later century moment, you hear whispers about newer treatments emerging like the diphtheria antitoxin of the 1,890 seconds. Evidence that the lab doesn't only explain disease, it can also, sometimes, blunt its teeth. Yet even here, access is uneven, timing is everything, and hope can arrive too late. Progress has a habit of showing up first in lecture halls, and only later on the narrow staircases where it is most needed. You walk back out into the street and feel the weight of this era's paradox. Knowledge is accelerating, but life still moves at the pace of rent, coal, and crowded rooms. At night, you pass a lamplight window and see, through the glass, a student hunched over a textbook, a microscope nearby, like a silent companion. You think of the future. That student is stepping into a future where invisible causes will become standard explanations, where antisepsis will become routine rather than optional, where public health will grow teeth and bureaucracy, and sometimes, mercifully, real power. You also think of what won't change quickly: poverty, inequality, the way the city's most vulnerable still live in the tightest air. As you walk, you feel the germ theory tide rising under every step, reshaping not only medicine, but the city's imagination. Disease is no longer simply in the air or in the constitution. It is in contact, in water, in droplets, in unseen life. And you, with your bag and your tired hands, keep doing the street-level work of translation, turning a revolution under glass into small, practical acts that a family can manage. A boiled cloth, a washed cup, a window opened when it can be, a careful warning spoken in a calm voice. You move on, because the city is still calling now with ambulances and police whistles joining the chorus, as if New York is learning to rush toward emergencies in a more organized way, its modern systems beginning to wake up. You notice the new sounds before you notice the new systems. A sharp whistle, 2 quick blasts, cutting through the street's usual hum, hooves accelerating, not in the steady patience of a horse car, but in a focused hurry. A small crowd parting the way water parts around a boat. And then rolling into view, something that looks like modern urgency trying on an older body. An ambulance wagon, not the sleek machine of later centuries, but a carriage built for a purpose. Its wheels louder, its movement more decisive, as if the city has finally agreed that some moments should not wait for a slow walk and a knock on a door. You stand near the curb as it passes, and you feel the strange shift in your chest, a mixture of relief and unease. Relief, because you've spent years watching emergencies handled in the most improvised ways. An injured man carried on a door ripped from its hinges. A child hauled through slush in someone's arms, while neighbors shout directions. A cart borrowed from a grocer. A wagon flagged down like a miracle. In those moments, time feels like a predator, and the city's chaos feels like an accomplice. Unease, because organization always comes with questions. Who gets the response? Who decides what counts as urgent? Who is trusted to touch bodies in public? And whether a system built for speed will remember to be gentle. You walk on, following the sound until it blends back into the city, and you think of Bellevue Hospital, whose name has been riding the air of New York for decades now. Bellevue has existed in one form or another since the early 19th century, growing into the city's great public hospital, the place where the poor, the injured, the desperate, and the unwanted are gathered into a single, sprawling, human story. It is not always a kind story, but it is a real one. In 1869, Bellevue begins what many later call the first hospital-based ambulance service in the United States. A formal system of wagons equipped and staffed to respond to emergencies and bring patients in quickly. It's one of those developments that seems obvious once it exists, and almost unbelievable that it didn't exist earlier. But the city had to become dense enough, and injured enough, and impatient enough to invent it. Now, in your daily rounds, you feel the ripple of that invention. You hear people say, "Send for the ambulance," with a new kind of certainty, as if the phrase itself can summon help. You see policemen glance toward street corners, where call boxes stand, those metal little shrines of communication, because the city is learning to connect its emergencies to its institutions. Telegraph lines, patrol routes, dispatch patterns. All the nervous system wiring of a modern city begins to hum louder, and you find yourself, more often, interacting with the men who arrive first. Police officers, sometimes firefighters, sometimes passers-by who have become accidental attendants. The street is a theatre, and emergencies draw an audience, whether anyone wants one or not. Tonight, the call finds you near a wide avenue, one of those streets where the city's movement feels like a river with a strong current. You hear shouting first, then the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the ground. A wagon has clipped a pedestrian, not with malicious intent, simply with the city's constant haste and imperfect visibility. You push through the gathering bodies without hurry, because hurry makes you clumsy. You keep your voice low, because low voice cuts through panic better than shouting does. You kneel beside the injured person, a man, conscious, dazed, breath coming in, fast little pulls. There's no need to paint it harshly. You see bruising, you see shock, you see a gaze that can't quite decide where to land. You ask simple questions. Can you hear me? Do you know your name? Do you know where you are? You check the pulse at the wrist. You watch the breathing. You keep him still, because stillness can be the difference between a manageable injury and something worse. A policeman arrives and tries to clear space, using his body like a gentle fence. "Give him air," he says, and it sounds almost tender, like the city practicing compassion with official words. Someone argues that they were just looking, and the officer repeats himself, and the circle widens. The air feels a fraction less used. Then, the whistle again, closer now. The ambulance wagon arrives with a practiced turn, wheels cutting the corner, horses snorting white breath. 2 attendants step down, moving quickly with a stretcher, their faces set in focused neutrality. Their calm is contagious. It's a kind of professional anesthesia for the crowd's nerves. You speak with them in short phrases, efficient as a checklist. Conscious, breathing, possibly broken ribs, maybe a concussion, needs observation. You don't pretend to certainty. You give the best map you have. They lift the man carefully, straps adjusted, blankets tucked. The stretcher slides into the wagon, like a drawer closing. The man's eyes find yours once more, fearful, trusting, confused, and you give him the only promise you can honestly offer, that he will not be left alone with this moment. As the wagon pulls away, the crowd dissolves in that familiar way. People linger long enough to feel like they witnessed something important, then remember their own lives, and scatter. New York's compassion often comes in short bursts, like matchlight, bright, brief, and gone. You remain for a moment, watching the street return to its usual churn. It always amazes you how quickly the city forgets. Another night, another emergency, and the system shows you a different face. A factory girl collapses near a doorway, and by the time you reach her, she is already surrounded by strangers trying to help. A man holds her shoulders. A woman fans her face with a folded paper. Someone has loosened her collar. Their hands hover awkwardly, fearful of doing wrong, yet unwilling to do nothing. You admire that. You always have. The policeman arrives again, and this time he seems uncertain whether to be commanding, or kind, or simply out of the way. You tell him softly to send for the ambulance, and he nods and moves, suddenly grateful for a clear instruction. The city likes orders when it feels helpless. When the wagon arrives, the attendants ask questions that sound almost modern. How long she was unconscious, whether she had been ill, whether she hit her head. They move with routines learned by repetition, and you realize this is what a system does best. It turns panic into procedure. Yet procedure can become cold if it forgets it is touching a person. You watch them lift her, and you notice how she flinches, half waking, frightened by hands she doesn't know. You step closer and speak to her in a low, steady tone, telling her where she is, what's happening, that she's being taken somewhere warm. You see the tension ease in her brow. Even in an organized response, a gentle voice still matters. As you walk afterward, you think of earlier decades when emergency care wasn't a phrase people used, just a scramble people survived. You think of how policing and medicine have been tangled in this city. Police wagons carrying the injured, jail cells holding the sick, hospitals receiving both patients and prisoners. The boundaries are never as clean as the paperwork claims. Now the boundaries begin to sharpen, and that is progress sometimes. But it also raises a question that sits quietly behind your ribs. Does the city's new speed belong equally to everyone? In richer neighborhoods, people can still send for private physicians, hire carriages, arrange care behind closed doors. In poorer neighborhoods, the public systems, police, ambulances, charity hospitals become both lifeline and leash. They are help, yes, and also a reminder that the city's care is often delivered on the city's terms. Historians still argue about whether these emerging emergency systems primarily reflect humanitarian concern, or efficiency, or social control, or some blend of all three. Perhaps it doesn't matter which motive lit the first match. What matters is who gets warmed by the flame. You see the new urgency too, in the way certain spaces become ready for emergencies. Hospitals develop receiving areas where patients arrive at all hours. Staff learn to expect suddenness. Supplies are arranged for quick use. Even the language changes. Accident cases, emergency, ambulance surgeon, terms that begin to sound normal. And for you, personally, the shift is practical. It changes the rhythm of your work. Some nights you are still the first called, climbing stairs into cramped rooms, listening to the body's quiet alarms. But other nights, you become a link in a chain, assessing quickly on the street, passing information to attendants, arriving at the hospital to follow through, or being summoned after the patient has already been transported to help interpret the story that arrived alongside the body. In a strange way, it makes you feel both less alone and more aware of how large the city has become. No single doctor can carry all of New York in his bag. The city is building systems because it has to. It has grown too big for improvisation to be the only method. Late one evening, you stand under a gas lamp, and watch an ambulance wagon disappear into the dark, its wheels fading into softer sound. The street around you seems briefly hushed, as if even the city is listening to its own new heartbeat. You breathe in, and you think of all the changes you've witnessed: water brought by aqueduct, streets swept with new discipline, invisible causes revealed under glass, pain softened by anesthesia, emergencies answered with speed, and you feel the next thought arriving, gentle and inevitable, like the first pale edge of dawn. After all this rushing and reform, after all this progress and compromise, what will the city ask of you at the end of the century? What kind of doctor will you be when New York's modern face finally settles into place? You walk a little slower now, not because the city has finally run out of emergencies, but because your own body has learned the value of pacing. New York is still New York, restless, crowded, always half a step from shouting, but the later years of the century add a different texture to the streets, like fresh paint that doesn't quite hide the older brick. Tonight, you drift toward the East River, where the wind has room to stretch out, and the water keeps it steady, in different rhythm. Ferry lights move across the darkness. Behind you, Manhattan rises in stacked windows, some bright, some dim, some already surrendered to sleep. You can hear the distant rattle of a horse car, and now and then, a sharp whistle that makes your shoulders lift before you remember to relax. In your mind, the century becomes a corridor of doors, stairwells, cramped rooms, a child's fever, a father's stubborn cough, dispensary benches, charity given and counted, the islands, where the city keeps its problem cases, across the water, the druggist's shelves, glittering with bottles that promise comfort, the operating space, where ether turns terror into stillness, and the harder fight begins afterward, against fever and infection. You've lived long enough inside these scenes that you can feel the city's changes without anyone announcing them. People say infection with more certainty now. They say disinfect, as if the word itself can guard a doorway. They talk about germs with the same practical annoyance they reserve for rats' unwanted life that must be kept out. You notice more boiling, more washing, more attention to what touches what. Even your own habits have shifted. You clean your instruments more carefully. You separate cloths when you can. You choose your words with more precision. When you warn a household how illness can travel, still, for all the new confidence, New York's nerves always return to the harbor. Ships arrive, and rumors arrive faster. In the early 1892, cholera flares again overseas, and the waterfront tightens like a fist. People talk about inspection and quarantine, about holds at the docks, about examinations that feel like judgment. Ellis Island opens in 1892, and the idea of screening suddenly has a famous doorway, a place name that carries both relief and dread. You don't work there day after day, but you feel its ripple when families in the lower wards speak about cousins delayed, about questions that feel humiliating, about fear of being turned away after weeks at sea. So you keep your voice neutral and your manner steady. Public health can protect a city. It can also become a tool of exclusion if fear forgets its own humanity. You've heard too many people speak as if sickness belongs to a language, a neighborhood, a face. You know better. Historians still argue about what drove this late-century tightening of public health science: civic responsibility, economic fear, social control. Living through it, you suspect it's braided from all of them, like everything else New York builds. Compassion and control, pride and panic, progress and compromise. Before the century closes, the map shifts too. In 1898, consolidation creates Greater New York, and suddenly the city stretches in the imagination: more boroughs, more bodies, more streets to keep clean, more corners where illness can hide. The paperwork changes, the boasting changes, but the human moments stay stubbornly the same. A child still runs a fever at 2 a.m, and a family still listens for your footsteps on the stairs as if they are the sound of rescue. A dock worker still breaks his hand, and his first question is still, "When can I go back?" A mother still sits beside an ill husband, hands busy with nothing, because worry demands motion, even when there is nothing useful to do. Late one night you climb into a tenement, where the hallway is cleaner than it would have been years ago. Someone has been sweeping, someone has been trying, but the rooms are still too full, and the air is still tight. A man coughs with a sound that makes your own throat go quiet in sympathy. You think of microscopes and stained slides, of how consumption has begun to take on a sharper outline in professional talk. Knowledge is a gift and a grief. Once you can name an invisible cause, you cannot unknow it. You do what you can without turning the home into a courtroom of rules. You advise sunlight when possible, cleanliness when possible, distance between mouths, and shared cups when possible. You say when possible with a gentleness that acknowledges the truth. Poverty makes even good advice feel like a dare. Still, you offer it, because sometimes the smallest changes are what keep hope from collapsing. Near dawn, you return to the river and lean your forearms on the railing. The sky pales. It is not a dramatic sunrise. New York rarely gives you pure beauty without noise, but it is soft in its own way. The first light finds the edges of rooftops and the faint steam rising from grates. A ferry horn sounds low and mournful, and the city answers with the distant rattle of a cart starting early. The first footsteps of workers who cannot afford to sleep in. For a moment, you picture the century as a long exhale, from bad air fears to microscopes, from improvised carries to ambulance wagons, from filth accepted as fate to sanitation fought for as policy. You think of how many people suffered while knowledge caught up. You think of how many survived because neighbors shared coal, shared water, shared a kind word on a staircase. You also think quietly of what remains unresolved. Poverty still compresses the air in certain rooms. Prejudice still travels faster than any health bulletin. Politics still decides who is protected first. The city's progress is real, and it is uneven, and it often asks the most from those who have the least to give. You straighten, feeling the familiar strap of your bag in your hand again. Somewhere behind you, a door will open, a voice will call, a family will wait in lamplight, hoping for steadiness more than miracles. And you will go because that is what you have become in this vast, changing city. A small moving point of care, carrying the century's new knowledge in one hand, and the old, human need for gentleness in the other. Now the pacing loosens, as if the city itself is finally willing to lay its head down for a moment. The river keeps moving, but quieter, like silk drawn through fingers. The gas lamps below burn with a steady glow, little pools of light where footsteps pass and then fade. You imagine tenement rooms settling into stillness, the last pot covered, the last blanket pulled up to a chin. You imagine hospital corridors growing hushed between rounds, the squeak of a cartwheel muted by distance, the soft rustle of linens as someone tucks a patient in. Somewhere, a library's shelves rest in darkness, heavy books closed, their pages holding centuries like sleeping birds. The clatter of wagons becomes rarer, spaced farther apart, until it feels like the city is breathing in longer intervals. Even the horses seem quieter in your mind, their breath turning to pale clouds that drift and dissolve. The last ferry horn fades into fog, and the water answers with its small, patient slap against wood. You let your shoulders drop. You let the troubles of that other century draft anger, cholera dread, crowded wards, harsh winters remain where they belong, tucked away like old newspapers wrapped around glass. Here, in your own room, in your own bed, you are safe. The air around you is yours. The darkness is gentle. Your breath arrives and leaves without anyone demanding anything more. And as New York's old brick and iron settle into quiet, you can almost see the candlelight of history dimming at the edges, softening sharp outlines into calm silhouettes. The city's long day ends the way all long days end, not with a shout, but with a slow, merciful hush. And as history closes its heavy books for the night, the quiet stars of another age watch over your dreams.